Thank you, Spencer. It's 9 minutes after the hour. For more than 6 weeks now, America has been following the voyage of a barge carrying 3,000 tons of garbage as it searches for a port, any port, that will let it unload its cargo. From Islip, Long Island, it sailed first to Morehead City, North Carolina, where the crew was told to keep moving. From Morehead City, it was on to New Orleans. From New Orleans to Mexico. From Mexico to Belize. From Belize back to the waters off Key West, Florida. Yesterday, an offer was made by the developer of a tiny island in the Bahamas. Maybe he'll take it. We'll see if the Bahamas will go along with it. I rather like Johnny Carson's suggestion that we send it to Iran. But it all underlines some serious problems, because last year America produced more than 150 million tons of garbage. That's enough to fill 50,000 of these barges. Government officials say that this somewhat humorous story has brought attention to the serious problem. Dr. J. Winston Porter is the Assistant Administrator for Solid and Hazardous Waste at the Environmental Protection Agency. He joins us from Washington this morning. And joining us here in New York is Fred Krupp, who is the Executive Director of the Environmental Defense Fund. And good morning to both of you. There are some serious points in all this, but I am still amazed by this barge story. Dr. Porter, I'm amazed that there is garbage being taken from Islip, Long Island down to North Carolina. Is there money in that? Does it have to be done? Why is the barge doing that?
Well, we're kind of amazed, too. We don't think it has to be done at all, and we want to see people, local officials and state officials, deal with the problem much closer to home. Presumably there was money in this transaction, but we don't think it's a good way to do business.
Why hasn't anyone taken this barge?
Well, I think fundamentally the notoriety of the barge has kind of gotten ahead of things. Our indications, this is pretty much plain old garbage, and just like the millions of tons we get rid of all the time, but it's required a notoriety, and I think all the local officials are running from the problem as fast as they can.
Fred, is this a common problem, a barge with no home? I mean, does this happen very often?
Well, it is. And in fact, it's a very sad commentary that here we are sending a barge adrift to nowhere with nowhere to go. And I think it symptomizes a real failure of leadership on the part of EPA to come up with a coherent national vision as to what we should do with our garbage. I mean, if this is not EPA's responsibility, what is?
Well, why is it? Dr. Porter, do you feel that the federal government has any role in this kind of thing?
Certainly we have a role. We have a role to provide technical assistance and to set standards and do a number of things. But there's 10,000 municipal landfills in this country, and there's lots and lots of jurisdictions that have to deal with this. And we think it's very important for local and state officials to address these issues. There's local planning ordinances, there's local zoning ordinances, there's local groundwater situations, all kinds of factors that EPA cannot micromanage for 10,000 landfills. And we really believe that while we'll do our part, the state and local officials have got to step up to this problem. We'll provide technical assistance, we'll provide standards and guidance setting, but we cannot micromanage 10,000 landfills.
Yeah, Fred, I must say, if there's anything that the layman looks at and says, this is a local problem, this is something that the states, the localities take care of, it's their own lousy garbage.
Well, it has been viewed as a local problem, but that view just hasn't worked. Each locality all around the country is now facing a crisis. There's no place to throw the garbage away. There is no way.
Why not landfills? I mean, you got a landfill, put it in there.
Well,
why isn't this stuff in the Islip, Long Island landfill?
What people are trying to continue to do, is to bury their garbage or to burn it. But it's been required now to take the garbage further and further away, and it's very expensive. Why not do that? Well, for one, it doesn't make sense. It's a waste of taxpayers' money. It's very expensive to cart this stuff further and further away. Two, it's silly from an environmental perspective to waste the materials. And finally, from the standpoint of fouling the groundwater and polluting the air, it doesn't make sense from the perspective of all of us in terms of the threat to our health.
So when you say wasting the materials, I gather where you're pointing me is that you believe there ought to be recycling plants being built. By localities or by the federal government?
Well, absolutely. In 1976, Congress decided that EPA should come out with procurement guidelines forcing the government, which is such a big user of paper, to buy recycled paper and whatnot. Until this day, some now 11 years later, EPA has yet to issue final guidelines mandating the purchase of recycled paper. If we could create some markets for these materials, recycling them makes a lot of sense. It's cheaper and it's a lot healthier.
Dr. Porter, how about that?
Well, I agree. I think recycling is very important. We are, about 40% of the material in garbage is in fact paper products, and we are issuing those guidelines he referred to this summer, as a matter of fact. and we think recycling is a big part of the answer. It needs to be pushed very hard, both in terms of metal recycling, bottle recycling, and most of all, paper recycling. But I think I need to stress that we're going to have landfilling and we're going to have incineration. Also, we simply have to have them, and they both can be made environmentally safe. I think it's very important we stress to people that you're going to have to deal with recycling, you're going to have to deal with land disposal. There's 10,000 of these units right now. There'll be others. There's about 100 incinerators and resource recovery units that recover steam and generate electricity and so forth. We need all those, and we need people at the local level and ourselves to step up to it and work on those issues.
Just a question of curiosity. We got about a minute left. Let me come back to the barge. Does this country produce more garbage per person or whatever than other countries do?
Yes, Charlie, it's double or triple that in Europe, and certainly we could maintain our high standard of living and reduce the amount of garbage we produce. There's no question about it, and there's a national role in that. National action by EPA could mandate that we just use a little less packaging, take a little more care in producing our products.
Should the EPA do that, Dr. Porter?
Well, I think that's very difficult to interact in that sort of commerce. We are going to be issuing guidelines of some nature, but a lot of this is going to happen as people run out of landfills. One of the things that's happening is the free market is driving us toward more recycling because it's frankly getting extremely expensive to deal with long-distance shipping or other ways of getting rid of garbage. So,
as this barge rather well points out.
That's right.
Fred Krupp, thank you for joining us this morning. Dr. J. Winston Porter. I thought Dr. J had retired, but we found a second Dr. J here. Thank you, Dr. Porter. Nice to have you with us. It's 16 minutes after. We'll be back. The war against drugs. Are we winning it or losing it? Stone Phillips here after this.
This is WJLA-TV, Washington's Channel 7.
150 million tons of it is produced in the United States every year, and it doesn't just go away. Good evening, I'm Ted Koppel, and this is Nightline. Suppose that all pickups of your trash and garbage just stopped permanently because there wasn't any place to put it anymore. A number of cities and towns are rapidly approaching that point right now.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
If you're looking for symbolism on the subject, look no further. Break of Dawn, the tugboat that is towing a barge load of commercial and industrial waste, has now been at sea just over 40 days and 40 nights. A little longer than Noah's Ark. And the flood, in this case the rising tide of garbage around this country, shows no signs of receding. No one has as yet volunteered to accept the barge load of garbage either. Every community that might have taken it claims to have more than enough garbage of its own. The fact of the matter is that while the United States has lost ground over the years in the production of steel, textiles, automobiles, no one anywhere is outstripping us in the production of garbage. Mark Potter picks up the story.
A 200-foot-long barge filled with 3,100 tons of garbage in search of a dumping ground. Enough garbage to equal the daily outputs of Detroit and Dallas. But it is garbage nobody wants. Since leaving Long Island, New York more than a month ago, it has made stops in Morehead City, North Carolina and New Orleans. But requests to dump the garbage there were denied. Unsuccessful requests were also made to Mexico and Belize. And according to the Coast Guard tonight, the barge is now 75 miles north of Cuba, heading back into the Gulf of Mexico. The city of Islip, New York, where the trash came from, is very embarrassed.
We're not happy. Islip is an old town. It's established in 1683. We're very proud people here, and we're not happy to be the butt of sarcasm on Johnny Carson's show or any other, David Letterman or the rest who I'm sure are going to take up on this. And it's a sad situation for us.
The problem began last November when the Islip Town Board voted to bar all industrial waste from its 75-acre landfill because it is nearly full and because the state would not allow the city to enlarge it. A private company was set up to move the trash elsewhere, but the plan isn't working because too many other cities in America face the same problem now. It is a national dilemma. Last year, the United States generated an estimated 150 million tons of garbage. In New York City alone, 2,400 tons a day.
We've got to find a different way of dealing with 90% of the trash. And all you have to think of is the fact that you put out bags of this every week, and if it doesn't go away, we're going to be overwhelmed. Something has got to be done. It is a crisis which I think has to be met in the next few years.
Many cities are running out of space to put the garbage. Among them, Philadelphia, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Boston. About 90% of the country's trash is buried in landfills, but it's estimated that half the cities in America will exhaust their current landfill space in just a few years. And many landfills are being shut down because of environmental damage, primarily to the underground water supply.
If the chemicals get into the groundwater beneath the landfill, ultimately this can contaminate the sources of local wells. And so people then will ingest the toxic chemicals and they will subsequently expose themselves to possible long-term health hazards.
Some cities that no longer have landfills are trucking their garbage now to dump sites in other cities or states. But in southern New Jersey, the residents of Gloucester County want their new landfill to themselves and are resisting efforts by cities in northern New Jersey to dump their trash in Gloucester County.
We're not in the business of taking other people's trash. We're in the business of taking care of our people's needs here.
You mentioned sort of the north-south dilemma, and I've even heard parallels about the Civil War. Fair?
Well, I wouldn't say it's fair in the sense that we're going to go to war over it, but fair in the sense that when you solve your own problem, we don't need a carpetbagger with a bunch of trash coming down to fill it. So in that sense, you might say it's a north-south situation.
Other cities, including Tulsa, Oklahoma, are getting around the landfill problem by burning their trash in energy-producing incinerators that operators claim are environmentally safe and can save money. This plant burns 750 tons of garbage a day. But critics claim smoke and ash from incinerators can be unsafe.
Every trash-burning incinerator that's been tested emits dioxins and toxic metals, some of which produce cancer. Dioxin, metal like chromium, induces cancer. We also know that the dioxins are now in everyone's body. The upshot of this is that dioxin is a cancer risk to which we are all exposed.
Another problem is that residents often oppose the construction of incinerators in their neighborhoods.
And you tell us, hey, trust you. Believe that you're going to take care of us. The underground water's going to be okay. Don't worry about it. Hey, you okay? We don't believe you. We don't trust you.
We're at the point now where we need answers, and everybody is giving us what we can't do, but nobody is giving us what they want us to do.
A solution preferred by environmentalists involves recycling trash, separating, then reusing the bottles, cans, paper, even the rotten foodstuffs for fertilizer.
Aluminum cans in a plastic bag.
You can do it in a bag.
Your newspapers in a bundle.
Now you're playing catch for trash.
In Rockford, Illinois, a television commercial urges residents to cooperate.
Easy. Come on and tell your friends.
But critics claim that recycling is not a long-term solution because it requires help from people at home, and not enough will go along with the plan. All parties, however, seem to agree that whatever methods are chosen, decisions need to be made quickly because communities have already allowed the garbage crisis to get out of hand, and as more landfills dry up, it will likely get worse. For Nightline, this is Mark Potter in New York.
When we come back, we'll be joined by Michael LeGrande, county executive for the Long Island area, from which that garbage barge without a dumping port began its odyssey in March. And we'll also be joined by Winston Porter, the senior-most official in the Environmental Protection Agency who deals with solid waste.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Lincoln Mercury.
Joining us live in our New York studios is Michael LeGrande, county executive for Suffolk, New York, which includes Islip, the town that's having so much trouble getting rid of its garbage. Mr. LeGrande, a professional engineer and city planner, was town supervisor of Islip for 7 years before election to his present post. And with us in our Washington bureau is Winston Porter, assistant administrator for solid and hazardous waste in the Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. LeGrande, it's not really entirely fair to say that the town of Islip is having trouble getting rid of its garbage. You can get rid of your garbage. It's the industrial garbage that is a problem, isn't it?
That's right, Ted. When we experienced the problem last year, we had to deregulate the industrial and commercial garbage portion of it, leaving it up to the industries and the various commercial enterprises in our town to dispose of their garbage. It was our assumption that they were in a better position to be able to do this rather than the individual families. We did this in order to preserve what remaining space we had in our landfill, and that was the primary motivation, and I think that that's what started the barge odyssey as well.
I mean, the garbage, though, must still be backing up. I mean, the industrial waste, whatever material there is from the industries in your area has still got to be backing up. Now, where in heaven's name are they going to put it?
Well, no, it's actually being trucked right now. It was originally being trucked to Pennsylvania, and from our understanding, the Pennsylvania landfills were closed out to the private sector that has been doing the trucking. They are now going as far as Pittsburgh and Buffalo to dispose of the industrial waste, and that's going on right now.
Just give people who don't have quite the sense of geography that you do, how many miles are we talking about there?
Well, we're talking, actually, when we were trucking to Pennsylvania, we were talking a trip of approximately 200 miles in one direction. Now, to Buffalo, I think that there's somewhere around 500 miles of travel that our garbage will be leaving the town of Islip and ending up in Buffalo.
Mr. Porter, it's kind of wacky, isn't it? I mean, in how many different areas of the country is that going on, that people are literally running out of space in their own backyard and having to truck it somewhere else?
Well, Ted, it's a real problem. I don't think things are quite as extreme as the situation just described, but we are having a real problem around the country, particularly in major urban areas where a landfill is getting short, and actually the other part of the problem is that it's getting very hard to site new facilities. People simply don't want landfills near their communities, and it's a combination of the running out of existing facilities and having difficulty locating new ones.
Give me a sense now, and I know that Mark Potter gave us a bit of a sense. What are the options? The options are what? Landfill, you can burn it, you can recycle it. The one thing that I didn't hear Mark talk about, and I'd like to hear you talk about for a moment, is reducing the amount of garbage output. I have a sense that we probably churn out more garbage in this country than any other group of citizens in the world.
I think that's right. We produce about 3 pounds per person per day of garbage in this country, and I think that is among the highest in the world. On the other hand, we do recycle already 15 million tons a year of various kinds of garbage and refuse, particularly paper. So it's not totally hopeless, and I think, to pick up on your question, the options basically are, as you say, recycling or source reduction, which we need to do much more of. Then once you've got it on the road, so to speak, you can either send it to a landfill or you can send it to a resource recovery or incinerator unit. And we're doing a fair amount of both. About 5% of the garbage is burned now. About 90 to 95% goes to landfills. And as I said, about 50 million tons a year is recycled right now.
Now, burning it, though, doesn't that have the capacity of at the same time that you're getting rid of at least 75% of the garbage, because the ash, as I understand, represents about 25% even after you're through burning it, doesn't that then also produce energy so that you derive a benefit from burning the garbage?
That's correct. Most of these units are now referred to as resource recovery units, and in fact, that they are. What we're doing is we're using the energy in the garbage to generate steam, and that steam in turn is used either to generate power or to be used in some kind of industrial process or heating use. So there is energy there to be recovered, that's right, as well as recovering the aluminum and cans and batteries and other sorts of things that are in the garbage. So there is raw material there.
Mr. LaGrande, take me back for a moment to whatever is happening to that barge. We have spent the better part of the day trying to get a hold of the owners of that particular company. I guess I don't blame him, but he is making himself somewhat scarce. Any chance of taking it back? I mean, this really is becoming kind of ludicrous, having that barge chasing, you know, like the Flying Dutchman halfway around the world. No one wants to take it in.
It is,
I mean,
Ted.
It's your garbage, isn't it?
Well, while it's our garbage, I have to tell you, Ted, that we would not have had the crisis had the state of New York interfered with the garbage situation on Long Island. I think the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, if we were to point the finger at one agency, has created the garbage crisis on Long Island by invoking a landfill burial law which calls for the termination of all landfills on Long Island, and then leaving local municipalities up to their own devices to try to make it to 1990 without any hopes or prospects of getting any cooperation from New York State. And as a matter of fact, it's because New York State has refused a modest extension of the existing landfill that would be triple-lined, by the way, and safeguarding the groundwater is in any way, or to the best state of the art, I might add, because the state has refused us that permission, we've ended up having to deregulate the commercial part of the garbage and sending it off. If we take that kind of garbage back in, Ted, we will have no more room in our landfill. We will run out before our resource recovery plant, which is under construction, will begin burning garbage in December.
All right, let me just ask you very quickly, though. Break of Dawn, the tug.
Yeah.
Will you let it come home?
Well, it's going to come home, but I think they should park it outside of Albany along the Hudson and remind our Albany lawmakers that they're the ones that created that tugboat, and they're creating other tremendous problems in other states as well.
All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll be joined by researcher and writer Cynthia Pollack, author of a recent study of the global problem of increasing garbage and a decreasing number of adequate disposal sites. With us now, live from our affiliate WEWS in Cleveland, is Cynthia Pollack, a senior researcher with the World Watch Institute, a research organization that analyzes global problems. Ms. Pollack has just published a paper on the solid waste disposal issue. Global problems. Is it a global problem or just an American problem? A U.S. problem?
It's a problem being faced by municipalities around the world, although we in America discard more waste per capita than any other country on earth. We throw away about 9 times our weight in garbage each year. But as we're discovering, there is no real way for the throwaways that we discard. But despite landfills filling up, very few municipalities have come up with viable alternatives.
Now, you heard Mr. LaGrande a couple of minutes ago talk about the care that they were going to take, the triple, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the precise word that was used. I guess it's, you know, to make sure that none of the...
Triple liner.
Triple liner, thank you. To make sure that none of the toxic material gets into the groundwater. How safe is that?
It'll be safe in the short term, but landfills, liners inevitably leak after a certain number of years. And in the past, many communities have had to stop drinking the water from their wells because of such leaks.
There is something else I wanted to raise with you a moment ago when you talk about the amount of garbage that we generate in this country. We also generate, I would think, an extraordinary amount of non-biodegradable garbage. In other words, plastics, things that simply do not deteriorate on their own and that you cannot burn, or can you, or should you?
Plastics is the fastest growing share of the waste stream. It now constitutes about 8% of what we discard. And plastics do not degrade in landfills. And when burned, plastics result in acid gas emissions and dioxin emissions.
All right, so what, as I think someone said on this program a few minutes ago, and I don't remember who, it's one thing to tell us all the things we can't do. What can we? What should we be doing?
The greatest potential lies in reducing the amount of waste we generate and in reusing and recycling a major share of our waste stream. What we discard are very valuable materials, and if they're not contaminated, but rather kept separately from the household level on, they have a very high value. And if a city can sell the materials, even for a relatively low price, it saves considerable sums of money because it doesn't have to pay for landfilling or incineration.
Mr. Porter, I have heard that you say that there's a very soft market, though, for some of these products.
That's right, Ted. There's a bit of a problem there, and I'm all for recycling, and I'm all for selling these materials where we can, but for example, lead batteries, we're having a bit of a problem with that these days because the price of lead is so low right now that there's just not much of a market for that. On the other hand, of almost half the waste stream is paper, and that segment's growing very rapidly. As we transition more to an information society, we produce lots and lots of paper, and there's plenty of room to recycle paper, and I think we could be doing much more in terms of recycling, but we probably aren't going to be able to rely totally on market forces. I do believe we're going to have to separate more at the source, and we're going to have to work hard at recycling, maybe a little outstream of the traditional sort of free market system.
All right, what ultimately is going to make us do that as a group of citizens? Are we going to have to wait until fear steps in, until someone says, hey, 6 months to go, and then all the landfill is gone, and we can't burn it, and it'll be another 10 years before we get the plant in place that can burn it? And folks, you're going to have to take care of your own garbage. Is that ultimately what it's going to take?
Well, it may not be quite that bad, Ted, but I think we're getting into a pretty difficult situation in many areas, and I think people are beginning to see this. They're beginning to see it in a number of areas. One, they're beginning to see people trying to site incinerators in their towns, and some like this, some don't. But I think what they're seeing is in these big metropolitan areas, the problem is pretty much on us, because it takes 5 to 10 years to develop anything really new in terms of a new land disposal or new incinerator, and many places have less than 5 to 10 years in terms of capacity left. So while we're not in a crisis yet, we're getting pretty close to it in some areas, and I think people are going to have to get very serious about recycling and very serious about incinerators, in my judgment.
All right, I want to talk about what specifically individual citizens can and ought to be doing, and we will get into that when we continue our conversation in just a moment. Continuing our conversation now with Michael LeGrande, Winston Porter, and Cynthia Pollock. Mr. LeGrande, in your community, for example, what are chances of getting people to separate the paper from the cans, from the, I mean, you know, have you tried that?
Yes, we have. We had the largest recycling program in the nation, Ted, recycling approximately 300 tons per week. Now, this is a community with 90,000 families in it. The best we were able to do was to get 30,000 families to comply, and it's an effort that has been taking us approximately 5 years of incessant education and constant requests and pointing out the dangers to our environment. It can work, but recycling is a long way off, and those municipalities facing garbage problems right now have the immediate problem of tomorrow morning having deposited on the curb another 1,000 tons of garbage, which they have to respond to every day. That's the biggest problem with all of the solutions that have been suggested so far.
Let me ask you, Mr. Porter, are we making a mistake? And I understand it has always been in the hands of the local municipalities, and in theory, I guess it always should be. Is there going to come a time, do you think, when the federal government is just going to have to issue a mandate and say, here's what we're going to do as a nation?
No, I don't think so, Ted. We're working hard on technical assistance and on how to do better landfilling and how to do better incineration and how to develop guidelines and so forth for these things in a technical sense. But I think it's largely a state and local issue. We're going to try to help as much as we can with technology and with requirements and regulations. But I just think we've got to work on the recycling. We've got to work on good land disposal, because we've got 10,000 land disposal systems in this country. They're not going to go away tomorrow morning. And we've got to work very hard on research, recovery, and incineration, in my judgment. And we're there to help, but we certainly can't do it for 10,000 units out there.
Now, Ms. Pollock, what we also saw at the beginning of this program was the suggestion that in some states, for example, and perhaps in some areas between states, you're literally getting not only a rivalry, there's kind of a bitterness here where people say, we've got landfill, I mean, we've got an area, but we're not going to make it available to you because we need it for us. Do you see any of these tensions arising that ultimately are going to require that states step in or that even the federal government steps in?
I think both state and federal governments do need to step in. And there are already 3 states in this country which have enacted recycling legislation: Oregon, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. The Oregon Act is only a year old, and yet the metropolitan Portland area is already recycling well over 20% of its waste, and the goal is to recycle 52% of the waste. They're well on their way to meeting that.
Now, Oregon is the best in the country, isn't it?
At present, on a statewide basis, yes, it is.
All right. I thank you all very much. It's quite literally, if there is any problem that we all have to deal with, garbage is it. And I thank you for enlightening us on the subject this evening. Tomorrow on The Health Show with Kathleen Sullivan, a look at treatments to contain the pain of migraine headaches. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
This has been Nightline. If you wish a printed transcript of this or any Nightline broadcast, please send $3 to Nightline Transcripts, 2 John Street, New York, New York, 10038. Nightline is a presentation of ABC News.
The hearings will stand in recess.
Coming up next on C-SPAN 2, the Senate Environment and Public Works Subcommittee focuses on the implementation of the Superfund program. Lee Thomas, administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, is among the officials testifying at the hearing under the chairmanship of New Jersey Congressman Frank Lautenberg.
Good morning, Lee. Porter, Wynn, how are you?
Good morning, Senator.
Messner, how you doing? Reminds me of the song, huh? Something about familiar faces, isn't it? Not in familiar places. We've changed the location. Going to bring this hearing to order, and of course we welcome our witnesses. Today we begin a series of Washington hearings on the implementation of Superfund. My work on the Senate Environment Committee and involvement with environmental issues over the years has brought home a key point. That our environmental laws are only effective if they're effectively enforced and managed. Yet too many times, the Congress approves legislation only to rush on to the next bill, and all too often we fail to monitor the agencies we have charged with significant responsibilities. In the last Congress, I devoted a good deal of time to amending our Superfund law. I worked to improve the law in the committee, on the Senate floor, and as a conferee, and Lee Thomas, you too worked with me and the others to do just that, to amend it and to improve it. And just before the 99th Congress adjourned, we approved a tough new law with cleanup standard schedules, right to know, radon protection, and we made great strides. And now I'm committed to seeing that the spirit and the letter of the law are vigorously implemented. New Jersey has an enormous stake in a successful Superfund program. Earlier this month, Region 2 Administrator Chris Daggett testified at a field hearing of the subcommittee. He noted that New Jersey will receive about $84 million in Superfund money this year. That's about 1/5 of all the money that's going to be spent in 1987. But money spent doesn't always mean a job well done. In the first 5 years of the program, EPA spent $1.6 billion, but it cleaned up only 5 NPL National Priority List sites. None of those were in New Jersey. To date, EPA considers only 13 sites cleaned up, and only 1 of these is in New Jersey. Our state has 100 National Priority List sites, I remind you. The Superfund amendments were aimed at improving this performance, but some of the problems we've seen require more than a tougher law. They require, frankly, better management by EPA. And this is strikingly clear with the agency's emergency response contracts performance. This involves EPA's hiring contractors to respond to emergencies at Superfund sites. We have evidence that EPA has swallowed unacceptable costs for that work. EPA allowed emergency contractors to mark up equipment excessively. One example was a 2-inch trash pipe used by cleanup contractors and subcontractors. When billed on an hourly basis, the use of that pump cost the subcontractors an average of 10 cents an hour. The subcontractors charged EPA $16 an hour. And if you extend that, you see a markup of 16,000%. The markup dropped if the pump was billed on a monthly basis, but it was still a huge 5,300%. The average subcontractor markup on an hourly basis for hand tools was about 6,800%, and 3,500% if billed on a monthly basis. Unfortunately, this wasn't an isolated occurrence. In the period from November 1983 to July 85, the EPA Inspector General documented numerous cases of these unreasonable costs across the country. Average markups on equipment for both subcontractors and contractors on an hourly basis was 321%, and the average markup even on a monthly contract basis was 143%. EPA oversight of labor charges also appeared lacking. There were cases in which EPA paid for worker overtime charges which were never paid to workers. Now, these are examples of a contracting process that doesn't seem to work. The basic problem was EPA didn't try to develop enough competition for these emergency response contracts. The agency did not have a system based on direct, tough negotiation and reasonable prices. The IG gave EPA until late December, just passed, to respond to that report on emergency response contracts. EPA missed that deadline, and the subcommittee investigated this matter following our contacts with the IG and EPA on this report. EPA finally submitted a response in February. The IG wasn't satisfied, and the subcommittee continued to explore this issue. I'm pleased that our focus on the issue has already borne some fruit. EPA has finally submitted a response that appears satisfactory to the Inspector General. It calls for greater competition for emergency response contracts. Instead of having just 4 prime contractors to do all this work, EPA will be seeking to establish relationships with 17 contractors this year and 8 more in the year following. Now, certainly more competition is welcome. We need that. But the results are still uncertain. None of the 17 contracts have been awarded yet, and questions remain. The key one is whether the agency has the resources to oversee and run an expanded program. If they couldn't manage a 4-contractor program, are they going to be able to manage a 17-contractor program? Are there other significant problems for Superfund? We think there is. One is EPA's management of the so-called cooperative agreements. That's where EPA pays a state to do Superfund work. States don't seek enough competition for Superfund work. We have documented cases where states allowed contractors to charge for and to do additional work not mentioned in actual contracts. This amounts to significant waste. One state awarded a contract that was $460,000 more expensive than the bid of the contractor deemed most qualified for the job. Another state sought reimbursement for about $560,000 of work that the Inspector General advised EPA not to pay. And EPA hasn't aggressively monitored these cooperative agreements. Another problem is cost recovery. Superfund is designed to make the polluter pay wherever possible. But the IG doesn't believe that EPA has done this. Of the $1.3 billion spent through 1985 on Superfund, only $14 million was actually recovered from those that contaminated the sites. Polluters paid for only 1% of these cleanups, and the government and the citizens of the country paid for the rest. We obviously have serious problems here. A record of inefficiency and mismanagement. To Lee Thomas's credit and that of his predecessor, Bill Ruckelshaus, Superfund is certainly in far better condition now than it was in its first 2 years of existence. But we have to make sure that we get what we pay for in the years ahead. We need a program that exacts reasonable prices for work, that does so without slowing down the cleanup program. And we need an administration that gets behind the effort that allows EPA to spend the money Congress has authorized and appropriated. Now, good management will not mean spending less overall. It will mean getting more for what we spend. The money we don't waste on non-competitive contracts means more funds for cleanup. Good management means adequate resources to manage, having enough top-notch personnel to get the work done, to oversee the states, to negotiate successfully with contractors, to enforce the law, and to make the program run. To gain perspective on this, it is fitting that we begin with the Administrator, Lee Thomas, EPA's head man and former Superfund chief. Lee, I welcome you and your colleagues here today. I appreciate the fact that it was a difficult session for you to schedule, and I appreciate that effort. I look forward to working with you and the Inspector General, John Martin, to get this program back on track. Now, before we hear from our witnesses, there are a couple of procedural matters. First, as the witnesses have been informed, it's our practice at oversight hearings to take sworn testimony. The oath extends to all testimony, whether given orally or written responses that may be requested at a later date. Secondly, the record for the hearing will remain open through the series of hearings we anticipate holding over the next several months. However, written follow-up questions for today's hearings would be submitted no later than 2 weeks from today, May 13. Third, I remind our witnesses that you'll have 10 minutes to summarize your written testimony. I will not cut you off if it extends a little bit beyond that. We don't have any other senators here, so the time is ours to use. I would therefore ask that you rise and raise your right hand and just repeat that you swear that the testimony that you're about to give to this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you very much. Lee, if you would, want to kick the ball back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and commend you for beginning your process of oversight hearings on the Superfund program, most important program to this Congress and to this country, and one that I have been associated with for over 4 years at EPA. First as the assistant administrator that managed hazardous waste programs, and for the last 2.5 years as administrator of the agency. With me today on my right is Howard Mester, who's my assistant administrator for administration and resource management. and as such is responsible for all contracting and finance issues, both the Superfund and other finance and contracting issues in the agency. On my left is Wynn Porter, who is the Assistant Administrator for Solid Waste and Emergency Response, and as such is the primary manager for the Superfund program in EPA. And they are available with me to answer any questions that the Chairman has. What I would like to do first is briefly summarize my written statement, which I would hope would be submitted in full in the record.
Indeed it will be.
Mr. Chairman, first I want to briefly give a program overview of where we are today. As you say, this is the first Washington hearing in an oversight of the new Superfund. So I'd like to talk briefly about where we are with the program. Then I'd like to talk about the specific areas of interest that you have asked us to respond to. The emergency response contracts and that program, our cost recovery program as a part of our enforcement efforts, and our overall state cooperative agreement program. But first let me say that the challenge I think we have in EPA today is the same challenge I saw 4 years ago when I came to the agency and began to manage Superfund. And that is a challenge to manage a large, complex program that includes many managers at a state and federal level. A program that can respond to the tremendous demands we have for action. Demands by the public, demands that we place upon ourselves, and demands that Congress places upon us, while at the same time maintaining cost effectiveness and program and financial accountability. That is our challenge as managers in EPA. That is a challenge, frankly, I think we're meeting. The Inspector General's reports which you cited are reflective of a good, strong Inspector General. EPA has the best, in my opinion. He is doing exactly what an Inspector General should do in an agency, exactly what I have asked him to do. And that is to go forward, just as we do on the management side, on the audit side, to look and find where we can be more efficient, where we've got problems in managing this large, complex program, and he has come forward with recommendations. And in many of those areas, we already were moving to take action, and in other areas, he pointed out where we should take additional action, or areas where action should be initiated, or recommendations on what action would assure more cost effectiveness, or more accountability. So what we're here to discuss today is how we're managing this program to meet that challenge, how we have responded to some of the issues that the Inspector General has raised, and how we respond to the questions that you and your responsibility as overseer of this program have. The program, I think, is moving back to a strong level after about 1.5 years of slowdown prior to the reauthorization of the program. The removal program, which is our emergency response program, has moved back up, and we're close to the 250 sites a year that we've set as our goal. Our engineering studies at National Priority List sites, after a sharp decline when we were waiting for reauthorization, has moved back up in '87 to the level which we've set as our goal, which is consistent with the goals that Congress gave us in reauthorization. Up past 150 new site starts a year. Our remedial design program, which is once we've determined the actual cleanup decision, also is moving up strongly to hit the targets that we've set. And our remedial action program, which is the actual cleanup of the sites, once that design has been initiated, also is back on the upward trend, hitting the targets which we've established for this year. As you know, Mr. Chairman, from the hours that you've spent in reviewing the status of the Superfund program since you've been in Congress, the engineering study, the design phase, and the cleanup phase are all on a part of a fairly long time frame that ultimately results in cleanup of a site, ultimately results in taking that site off the national priority list. But in the majority of cases, that process is a lengthy one, on average exceeding 5 to 6 years. There were targets set in Superfund 2. How many new sites would we begin as far as engineering studies are concerned, and how many new site cleanups would we actually initiate for national priority list sites? As you can see from this chart, we're not only on target, but we're exceeding target as far as our projections are concerned based on what the statutory requirements were. the remedial investigation feasibility study starts, which are the engineering studies at the National Priority List sites. We anticipate exceeding the statutory targets by over 100 sites. The remedial action, actual cleanup initiation at a site, we anticipate exceeding statutory targets by approximately 50 sites. These are currently targets that are not only reflected in our planning, but are reflected in our budget request to Congress. One of the things that we need to think about when we think about managing this program is the size of the program. We not only have new site starts, as I indicated from the last chart, we also have an ongoing process of managing existing projects, in that those projects last a number of years once we start them. That includes both the removal projects as well as the remedial projects. If you look at the removal projects, which is one of the areas you want to focus on today, it's the program that we try to make most responsive to the immediate public health or environmental problems at sites. It's the part of the program that we can respond immediately with action. And as you see, we've moved that program back up to nearly 200 to 250 sites that we will attempt to clean up under that program each year. We have identified problems in the past as to how that program was being managed. You enumerated some of them. I can tell you that as far as bottom line cost at sites, we feel we have gotten a good price. You can go into an individual contract and you can talk about how much we paid for one piece of equipment versus another. But bottom line cost, we got a competitive price. We also, however, feel competition is a major issue in those projects, and we're moving to expand the competition. We're moving to expand oversight and management. We will double the number of contract managers we have on that staff to look at those projects, oversee those projects from a financial management point of view this year. We'll move to put in and are putting in better cost accounting systems. We're looking at requiring better cost accounting systems on the part of our subcontractors. But bottom line, we think we got good prices for the work done, competitive prices with what the private sector and other government agencies are paying. We're going to work to improve that record.
Lee, before we leave that, I wonder if you would, in synoptic form, just define removal versus remedial, because I think for people who are not as familiar with these programs as you and I and others are, removal sounds like the ultimate action. Obviously, that's not. Would you mind?
That's a good point, Senator. The removal program is the emergency response program in Superfund. It is the program, it does not require a match on the part of the state government. It's 100% federally funded or 100% funded by responsible parties, but it is that portion of the program in the law that was identified to respond to a problem that requires an immediate action. Now, the definition is one that's broad of what is immediate action. It actually can extend out to a year. It can extend up to over $1 million at a particular site. Congress gave us broader authority under the new law than we had under the old law. The old law was 6 months and up to $1 million, and that's now been expanded. But it is the part of the program that one has to respond to an immediate situation. In other words, if you've got a problem at a site, say an explosion, or you find a site where you've got hazardous materials or hazardous waste that's presenting an immediate problem to the public, we can respond under this program. But we also can respond to this program where we have a problem that we think over the next 3 to 4 months will present an environmental problem. So it is the program that is more immediate response program, as opposed to the remedial program, which is the more long-term cleanup, and the one when we talk about our national priority list sites, we look to the remedial program as the one that is going to deal with the long-term consequences at the largest sites, which are remedial sites. A removal actually may be conducted at a remedial site to stabilize that site. So there is some overlap between the two.
It doesn't necessarily mean physical removal, however.
It can, but not necessarily. As a matter of fact, we are emphasizing more and more the treatment and disposal of the waste, in many cases, on site. In the removal program, you will find that more of the waste is actually removed from the site and taken to a treatment facility off-site than in the remedial program.
It needs a change in nomenclature, I think. It's really stabilization. That's what the mission is.
It is stabilization, but it is also destruction. You'll find that in the majority of these sites, we actually had finished the cleanup at the site. We actually took the waste, took it to an off-site disposal facility, and finished the cleanup at that site.
Thanks, Lee.
Second issue that I wanted to emphasize today is the enforcement program. The enforcement program is one of the important parts of the Superfund program. When Congress reauthorized it last year, you strengthened these parts of the program. Payment by responsible parties for cleanup wherever we can find them is a critical part of our program. And as you can see from the top line, we have accomplished this at nearly 400 sites for over $600 million through settlements. So the upfront enforcement program to try to find responsible parties and get responsible parties to do the work has been a major part of the program over the last 5 years and will continue to be. The second part of the program, which was focused on by the Inspector General, is the cost recovery program. That is, where a responsible party has not been found and we use Superfund money, then we actually go after the responsible parties to recover that money through courts. It appears it's small when you look at the line at the bottom, but let me explain to you why that is the case. The cost recovery program is the program we use once we've expended the Superfund money. I've already indicated to you the kind of time frames required to complete remedial action, which is where the largest part of the money is concerned. Look at this chart. $1.8 million obligated in the first 5 years of the program. Of that, you've got a portion that we call undistributed. That is, it is not distributed to a particular site. For instance, our research and development program on hazardous waste is not a site-specific program. It's a broad authorization Congress gave us to do overall research and development under Superfund for hazardous waste cleanup. It's undistributed. Most of the money, however, can be distributed. Direct site cost, we've got an indirect cost rate for the agency. A portion of that, however, those sites don't have viable responsible parties, PRPs, potentially responsible parties. So there is nobody at that site that we can get the money back from. It is an orphan site. We can't find the PRPs, or the PRPs may be bankrupt. Now, we still have the majority of the money that can be allocated to responsible parties. And of that, we are at a stage where at this point we've got about $460 million of the 1.8 that is ready for recovery. In other words, we finished the work at the site, we're pulling the documentation together and preparing the case. We've actually moved forward with the Justice Department now on about $300 million. Now that goes through the judicial system. Of that amount, we've literally recovered about $50 million. We've got about $250 million that is in the case process. In other words, it has been filed with the court, or it has been referred to the Justice Department, or the case is actually moving through our process. So when you look back at that last chart and you see the cost recovery line at the bottom is small, it is because of timeliness. That line will move up. In our projections over the next 5 years, a substantial amount of the money will be recovered. And as you look over the last several years, you can see that program picking up. The final issue which you have raised that I wanted to respond to is the issue of state cooperative agreements. The Superfund program is a big program. A big part of managing that program, I believe, should be handled by the states. It's large. Many of the states have very strong capabilities to respond to these problems, just like your state of New Jersey, and working with them, I think we can share the responsibility for managing site work so we can get more work done. The way we do that under the Superfund program is through a cooperative agreement. We have found, and our Inspector General has found, that we need to strengthen aspects of that cooperative agreement program. We are doing that through training programs, through procurement exercises with state governments, through pre-audits with state governments, through ensuring that we have better guidance, through ensuring that we strengthen the cooperative agreement document itself. All of those things are underway. I must tell you that my intention is to expand the role of state government in managing the Superfund program. I believe there's strength there. I believe we can get far more work done if we both use the strengths we've got. And as you can see from this chart, during the first 5 years of the program, nearly $240 million was managed by the states for site cleanup under cooperative agreements. In the next 2 years of the program, this year and next year, I intend to exceed that figure substantially. Next year, I intend to award under the cooperative agreement program nearly as much as we awarded under the first 5 years. So strengthening our oversight of states, strengthening the guidance to states, strengthening the document and training for states on how to manage those cooperative agreements is an essential part of our program. So in summary, Mr. Chairman, I feel like the program is a large program and certainly growing larger. It is a challenge for EPA, it's a challenge for the state partners, it's a challenge for oversight committees such as your own to ensure that the challenge that I laid out initially is met. And that is that we manage a large program, we ensure that it is responsive, as much response as possible to the demands for action, while also ensuring the integrity of the program from a financial and program point of view. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, and I appreciate the fact that you asked our Inspector General to share his thoughts with you after we conclude. My colleagues and I would be pleased to respond to any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Lee. The charts are interesting. At the same time, I think somewhat provocative, especially in the one that deals with the cost recovery. And we'll talk about those several things as we go along. In the beginning, in my opening statement, we talked about some of the contractor markups. They run, as I indicated, even up to 1,000% for equipment use. The average markup for contractor-owned equipment, 321%. Some cases, contractors charge you for overtime work, but they didn't pay their employees at an overtime rate, a time and a half rate. You did say that you were putting in a better cost accounting system. Do I quote you correctly?
The issue has to do with both our oversight of payments to contractors and subcontractors, but the cost accounting system is the system that the contractor is required to have. It is a contentious issue because when we competed our contracts, as do most other government agencies, we competed it based on bottom line prices that we were going to get for work. We looked at proposed rates to be charged. We looked at how overhead would be incorporated into those rates. But we were competing on bottom line costs to ensure that we were getting a good price for the government as opposed to the individual components. Now, we are going further. Your question asked how much further.
Well, the question that I asked is in response to something that you said, and I'm just trying to set the tone so that we understand one another here. And that is that you said that you have improved or are in the process of improving your cost accounting system. Did I hear you correctly? I mean, your colleagues say yes, I assume.
You heard me correctly, but it's not only our system, we're also requiring modifications by our contractors and subcontractors.
Right. A change in process, a change in procedure that's going to enable you to get a better handle on these things.
That is correct. I want you to understand, though, that there is the potential of difficulty in getting subcontractors and contractors who are willing to keep the level of detailed cost accounting that we are looking at requiring.
The fortunate aspect of this part of my senatorial opportunity is that I come from the corporate world where I did some of this, so that in this case we're dealing with an area of some familiarity. And when we talk about improvement in systems, it does say that the systems as they existed before this weren't quite at the level that we want them to be. And these violations, whether they're de minimis or not, suggests, and I know that you are if not a student of management, you're a practitioner of good management process. And when you say that improvements are in order, backed up by the fact that we had these glitches along the way, it says that there was a problem in the past. And
that's right. That's right. You're right.
Okay. So that at this point, with having looked at some of these incidents, are you confident that you've taken the steps to totally eliminate these overrun figures? Are you, where are you along the path here? Are you halfway through? Because we're going to be talking next to the Inspector General, and I was pleased to hear your overview as to what his job is. You know that he has a responsibility that makes us all function better, we hope. And so how far along the way are you to having a totally airtight system? You may never achieve that level, but...
Howard, why don't you give him an overview of it?
Mr. Chairman, I think we're making very good progress. I'd like to comment, before I describe the progress, briefly on your observation that if we are improving and changing our system for getting detailed cost information, doesn't that indicate that we've had a problem? The answer to that is yes. It did indicate that we had a problem, and as the Inspector General did his work and we began to understand some of the issues that we hadn't addressed, we've taken countermeasures to deal with them, but there's a point that has to be made that's very important to the federal interest in this. The way we ran our contracting system, as we receive bills from individual contractors, and let me say that having looked at a lot of the work, they are, for the most part, first rate. The contractors that we've used have struggled very hard to do new tasks. They had a lot of unknowns. They took a lot of corporate risks. This was a not well-defined piece of work.
How do you define or explain first rate? Are you talking about regardless of cost, including cost?
In both areas.
You haven't really had a very good opportunity to test that. I mean, there's not a lot of experience out there so far.
Well, in this case, though, Senator, you're talking about work at over 700 sites.
Yes, sir. With responsiveness, and as we talk to our project managers and our regional offices and the people who oversee these contractors, the substance of what they've done, given the circumstances that they're struggling with in a new field, based on my experience of some 25 years looking at these problems, they have responded, for the most part, extremely well. In the cost area, we have an ongoing discussion with the IG of profitability. Profitability on a particular item, as you, I'm sure, know from your experience, doesn't mean you're making money on a contract overall. Now, the system that we have in place says we will pay the bill. The IG will then come in and do a price audit. If, in our judgment, the government's judgment, we've been overcharged in any item, we routinely recall those funds from the contractor, so that there was built into the system a recognition of the possibility that particular items would be disputed and the government's interest should be protected. Now, having watched the IG's audits, and I can tell you, as he will testify, that he and I have spent more time together on this issue than on any other subject within the EPA in my 4 years back at the agency. Having looked at his material, we've decided that it is more in the government's interest if we can build up the cost data from the contractors that Lee was talking about to really move away from a fixed price, which may allow for high costs.
Fixed price, not fixed contract. You're saying fixed price. You're talking about
within the contract.
Fixed, right. You're talking about fixed costs for labor, equipment, materials,
yes,
that kind of stuff.
We want to move more.
That kind of terminology bothers me a little bit, I must tell you, because when I hear fixed cost, I hear $1 million for this job. Let's do the whole job, and whatever the components are, they are. But what you're referring to as fixed price is the labor rate, the equipment rate, and so forth.
correct.
Without any cap on that, that causes the contractor any urgency, any concerns about how long, other than his own good reputation. You know, that's pretty kind of a subjective thing.
Yes.
There is no pebble in that shoe to get the thing done sooner.
Except the comparison of performance between contractors, which we constantly monitor, and the audits that we do of those costs after the fact. And as I say again, the government's interest is protected, because if we find out, as in the case that you cite, that a pipe was overcharged, and we believe that in that case there may be an overcharge, the cost that he was dealing with, we believe probably should have been in the range of $20 to $40 a day for that piece of equipment, because you got to figure in things other than the actual piece of equipment, maintenance, indirect costs. If we feel that we've been overcharged, the government has not closed the matter until the audit's complete. We'll go back and get that cost. Now, it would be much better to set up, as you suggested, an incentive system so that costs are held to a minimum while the work goes on, and I think that level of sophistication has to do both with our learning experience in these first 5 years, the state of an industry which isn't traditionally been doing business that way, and bringing about the kind of financial improvements to, as Lee pointed out, not only our system, but to the contractor system. And I conclude, and I'm sorry, thank you for letting me speak so long.
I want to interrupt. We have the chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee here, Senator Burdick, and Senator, would you want to make an opening statement? We certainly welcome that if you'd like to, and we'll then pick up after that with the questions.
I have an opening statement. I'm just pleased to see Administrator Thomas again. We've been on a lot of hearings together. Just one area you want to enlighten me a little bit. How are these state cooperative agreements are working out?
Senator, the state cooperative agreement program, we feel, is an essential part of the program, and one that I'd like to see expanded. We've identified some problems with that program, some problems that we're trying to overcome, and I think we will. Problems largely have to do with state procedures being consistent with federal procedures on things like procurement, state personnel being fully versed in the management of the program as we expected. Now, we're putting in place a number of things that we think will overcome the problems we've identified, but our projections are to expand significantly the state cooperative agreement program, because that is the program that we intend to use to try to expand state involvement in managing the larger number of sites that we've now got to manage. We also, under that program, hope to basically fund a core capability in a number of the strongest states to fund an ongoing cleanup activity in that state in conjunction with the federal cleanup program.
I think it's a very important portion of the program, and I'm glad that your testimony gives it a positive rating at this time. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks very much, Chairman Burdick. Senator Pressler has come in. We're in the middle of doing some questioning here, Senator Pressler, but if you have an opening statement, we'd certainly
I want to follow the line of questioning, but I would say at the onset that I want to commend you, Mr. Chairman, for these hearings and oversight. My state has had use of Superfunds in some instances, but not as much as many other states. We don't have as large a problem as some other states have. But I think that the fact that Congress reauthorized the Superfund program last year, and that reauthorization significantly increased the cost and scope of the program. As a result, approximately the same amount of money will be spent in 1987 as was spent over the previous 5 years under the Superfund program. So with that sort of an increase, it's very appropriate that we should have close oversight. When funding for any program increases so dramatically, it is critical that precautions be taken to assure that the increased funds are properly spent. I am encouraged by the steps taken by the EPA to eliminate potential abuses in the program. I look forward to hearing how these steps have worked and what future actions the EPA plans to take in this area. And I am particularly interested because I'm very concerned about the environment and about what occurs when there are problems. We have a substantial pipeline leakage problem in Sioux Falls, South Dakota now, which is not under this program. But citizens are very concerned about the quality of water, water for human beings to drink and use, the quality of air, the quality of the environment that we live in this country. We can only be competitive with the Japanese if we do have a good use of the Superfund program. So I'm glad to be here, Mr. Chairman, and I commend these hearings, and I hope to help out as much as I can.
Thank you very much, Senator Pressler. I'm going to go back to the kind of some fundamentals here. You presently have 4 zone emergency response contractors. You're divided up into 4 emergency zones, and they're now presently populated with 4 emergency contractors.
What we did, Senator, is we were looking to have a response program, emergency response program, of contractors who were qualified and able to respond within 24 hours to any response required, actually a 2-hour mobilization capability. Because we wanted them to be able to respond to the immediate emergencies I talked about, as well as any of the other emergencies that would fall under our removal program. We competed, we set the country up in zones. Each of those zones, 4 of them as you indicated, has 1 prime contractor with a series of subcontractors to respond to those programs.
Does that include Alaska in the zone?
Yes.
What kind of geography are we talking about in these zones?
Man, you want to...
Well, most of the zones are related to the eastern part of the country, the more populated parts, and there's a large contract for most of the west, including Alaska. But they have different offices.
Well, what's the smallest zone perimeter that we...
I don't know, but exactly the northeast would be the smallest geographically, because that's where you have the greatest concentration of course, situations.
That's northeast. Where do you start the northeast and the southern end and the western?
Exact details. I could furnish you a map on that. But it is...
The 4, I mean, it's obviously the kind of a base network structure to work from, but...
That's right. There are numerous subcontractors who are qualified under each of the primary zone contractors. The zone contractor manages the overall network in his zone. As Wynn indicated, when the zones were established, we looked at projected work, how many sites did we think there would be, and we looked at geographic coverage. Now, the amount of work projected is what drove the size of the zones, is probably more so than geographic coverage. And 3 of the zones are basically from Chicago east, and the 4th zone is from Chicago west, including Alaska.
Okay, and those are where the area in which we'll call someone if we have an emergency, we need containment or stabilization, or to use the broad term, removal. So there's got to be some readiness costs for included in those.
A large part of, and this is one of the issues we've gone into as we look at recompetition, and we can speak to at some length, but a large part of the requirement that we built into our zone contractors was a requirement for immediate response, as I indicated, and emergency response. So you're not talking about a contractor, say a typical contractor who could go out and bulldoze a site. You're talking about a contractor who can manage hazardous materials at a site. So they have to have the emergency response capability for hazardous materials and readiness response of a 2-hour response time.
Well, certainly it doesn't seem, at least on the surface, to be the most efficient way when it's spread out that far because of distance and the problem of moving equipment and moving the personnel, but it was a basic structure, I take it. Now I'm sorry.
What happens, Senator, is in many of those cases, the contractor has designated subcontractors who handle various parts of the zone. So it's not that we're moving equipment from one part of the country to another part of the country. You're using equipment in a location. You have subcontractors who respond. You may have a zone contractor who responds by overseeing a sub on a site with personnel. One of the things that we have done, though, and is one of the things I think that is going to be more responsive under our recompetition, is we have looked at the types of response, and we've determined that all of our contractors don't need to have the 2-hour response capability. We can divide up types of response so that we can have longer lead time, and therefore we think we'll get a better price. We'll also expand the competition by the number of contractors who feel they'll be able to respond, but not necessarily in the time frame that we had required under the earlier contracts.
Well, if you're going up to from 4 to 25 regional response contracts, is that?
That's correct.
Okay.
17 this year, Mr. Chairman, and 8 next year. One of the 17 has already been awarded. The rest will be awarded by the end of the year.
I wonder how well structured or how well prepared EPA is to do this. Again, this oversight is intended to expose the problems for all of us, to make sure that A, there's comprehension of what's out there, and B, that we try to fix it. And I'm concerned, Lee, if we've seen some of the problems that have occurred managing 4 emergency response contractors. We take this up, and I agree with you that we ought to be taking it up to a larger number so that the distances are reduced and that we have more competition. I think the lack of competition has cost the government a lot of money. And I think you'd find it hard to refute that, because wherever we don't have enough competition, we know that we have to pay heavily for the few that are there to supply services. But are we going to be able to manage the 18, 17 contractors, then the 18, in what I hope is going to be better fashion? It's my editorial comment, because we've seen it's not just that the numbers suggest that we have a problem, that the distances, etc., but we've seen these problems erupt where there are the incidents of overcharge. And I happen to believe that in management, an important factor in the consideration of the way you run things is to measure critical incidents. If you see enough problems coming up, you've got to say, hey, there's something wrong with the basic system. So are we going to be able to manage?
I think we can, Senator, and your concern is a legitimate concern, one of the same ones that I had, and I think there are 2 elements to dealing with it. We operate, as you know, out of 10 regional offices, and we have on-scene coordinators in each of those offices who are basically the program manager for one of these kind of emergency response sites. What we've done is we've not only expanded the number of those program managers to better manage the substance of the work that's done by these contractors, but we've now more than doubled this year the number of financial managers or contract managers that will be available in our regional offices, putting them in our regional offices to not only manage the procurement or the process of selecting contractors, but importantly as well, the actual work of the contractors that's ongoing. So as we indicated earlier, we're changing the requirements for keeping the cost data that the contractors will have to maintain, and we're expanding our staff who will oversee and manage these contractors out of our regional offices. I think that as we've looked at both, I think not only will we improve price through expanded competition, through taking a look at the requirements we've got and having requirements that are more reflective of the work to be done as far as readiness is concerned, but also expanding the staff in each of our regional offices significantly to oversee the work that these contractors will do.
Is it correct that EPA is having problems getting contractors to do good cost accounting?
Go ahead.
Most of the contractors who are involved in this field don't have other uses for the kinds of cost accounting systems that would produce really finite data for us. They don't market their wares that way. This industry is a bottom line pricing industry, and it usually competes based on comparative costs. You know, what they will charge, what one company will charge versus one other company. In other words, to the extent that there's
comparative cost, that's comparative price.
Well, you're quite right.
I mean, they're saying here's what the market will bear, and therefore that's what we got to charge, or that's what we have an opportunity to charge.
Well, the competition, the marketplace competition, if there is enough competition, will act as a natural brake on pricing, and that has been the nature of this industry. As we expand our work and put in all kinds of new requirements and dollars into the industry, we have pushed on the industry to begin to develop the kinds of accounting systems that we not only can turn over to the IG to audit, but that we can have confidence in. I personally think they will respond. They'll respond because the federal government is saying we want it and we won't do business without it. They'll respond because the nature of the size of the federal commitment in dollars is very attractive to a larger proportion of companies than it used to be.
It's essential if we're going to, 1 second, wait, it's essential that we have good cost accounting if we're going to be sure where the money is going. I mean, our mission is not to fatten up the contractors' profits. I mean, that's, we want to try to buy right.
Senator, I just want to be sure that one point is clear, and that is there is a tension here, as Lee has indicated, with these kind of companies, is how far we can push them in terms of accounting. I've certainly had a number of them come to me that they say, we don't operate that way with about 3/4 of our work. Most of them say that about 3/4 or 80% of our work is with private industry. They're used to charging on a rate for a piece of equipment or for a cleanup on a job basis. We're pushing them fairly far, and I'm all for that in terms of accounting procedures. But I've had a number of them come to me and say, we just don't want to do business. We can do business with the private sector without having that kind of accounting. We don't have those kind of books. And I think the tension here is between, what I want is a lot of competition. And we got 200 people who came the other day to a meeting we had that said they want to work in this program. So we're trying to skate kind of a fine line here between the competition aspect and taking fairly small businesses, in fact, rather small businesses, and saying to leverage a real elaborate accounting system. And that's one of the tensions we have.
These are sizable contracts. Now, if these guys aren't doing anything else but waiting for the government to issue a contract, of course, we have one heck of a problem on our hands. But for them to suggest that in the private world they can go out and do T&M, time and materials bidding on jobs, I don't think, frankly, is honest. Now, if it's akin to a fire company's response to a fire, of course you can't do it. But there ought to be more organization of this than to simply say, okay, raise the flag, here's an emergency, and call in the contractors and we'll pay whatever they want. That's not where we are.
No, and that's certainly not the way we've operated, and it's certainly not the way we intend to operate.
Okay, Senator Pressler, I do want to acknowledge the presence of our former beloved chairman here. We've all seen the response, Senator Stafford, that you've got in going. I assume that you had just as enthusiastic response in coming some years ago. If there's anything that you'd like to say by way of opening statement, I'd appreciate that. Otherwise, we'll go on to...
No, I have no opening statement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am interested in what's being said this morning because of a long interest, as Lee Thomas knows and you know, in Superfund and its fate. And I have another matter at the appropriate time I wish to direct a question on to Mr. Thomas.
Thank you. You can appropriately be described as, if not the father of, certainly a parent of Superfund, and everyone knows how much work you've done in behalf of the environment. We're always grateful to see you.
Mr. Chairman, at times I think the program was considered somewhat illegitimate, but we legitimized it.
We're not allowed to use that
year.
kind of language. Senator Pressler.
Mr. Chairman, I just have two questions, and I do apologize. I'm moving between 2 or 3 committees this morning. But in my home state of South Dakota, the Whitewood Creek in the Black Hills has been listed as a Superfund priority item. Extensive studies have been done in the area. Followed, will the site remain on the Superfund list, or will its status be changed?
Wynn, you may want to fill in behind me, but I know that as a site we have worked with the state on for a long time. It's a contentious site. It's one that if there was a determination that no action should be taken at that site for the reason you mentioned, in other words, action may actually aggravate the problem rather than resolve the problem, then you would go through the process of actually proposing to delist that site, which means to take it off of the Superfund list. Wynn?
Yeah, I don't think I can add too much to that, Senator. We're taking a look at that site now, and there's a number of alternatives, as you suggest, and we're working closely with the state and others to try to decide what to do. but we will go through a number of options, and as Lee indicated, depending on what they turn out, we'll either start the delisting process or we'll have to start some remedial process. We are very concerned about those kind of sites in the sense that, as you point out, a massive removal of huge amounts of tailings may not be the best thing environmentally. And so we'd have sort of special considerations in those kind of sites. We're certainly looking at it.
Now, in general, switching to a general subject, will the removal program, while the removal program is certainly an essential component of the overall Superfund program, a substantially larger amount of money will ultimately be allocated to remedial actions, as I understand it. What steps are you taking to improve control management in this area? And will the remedial actions, as I understand it, that includes where ground has been contaminated and you have to restore the ground, so to speak, where water has been contaminated, you have to restore the water to a good quality. That seems to me that would be even far more expensive than the removal programs where you just remove the chemicals.
It is, Senator, far more expensive, and the remedial program both is a far more time-consuming program because of the extent of the problem you have, extending generally at each site over a number of years. Over half of those sites we find do have groundwater contamination, and generally that extends as far as the cleanup of that groundwater an even further period of time and is very expensive, as you indicated. We are taking the same kind of steps in reviewing our contractors and accountability and oversight of the contractors under the remedial program that we're taking under the removal program. There are different requirements for those contractors, and a large part of the difference is the responsiveness requirement of the removal, the readiness requirement of the removal contractors, but you have the same kinds of requirements for remedial contractors, and that is their ability to actually deal with hazardous waste and hazardous materials at these sites. But you're talking on average probably a 10-to-1 cost factor when you compare remedial to removal. Probably that much more expensive at a remedial site.
Lee, could I just add one thing to that? Senator, one thing I want to mention, I think it's important here too, Senator Lautenberg, is that we're in the remedial program as well as the removal program moving to much more competition. We've had zone contractors also in the remedial program, and instead of the 4 or 5 of those, or in addition to those, we'll be adding a number of new contractors in that program, starting with EPA Regions 3 and 5. We're also going to be moving more toward a project management approach where we have a contractor who has overall management of the technical effort at the site. This is one thing I wanted to do instead of having quite as many people involved at a site so we can move the work more quickly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Preston. Senator Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Thomas, without cost recovery, Superfund becomes, in effect, just a public works program. Much of our effectiveness of the law's liability provisions in terms of changing industry is lost without recoveries. I think you would agree with that. Can you tell us how many dollars you have been able to actually recover in the Superfund's 6 years of existence? To actually recover in the Superfund's 6 years of existence.
Senator, let me ask him to put this chart back up, and let me point out a couple of things. One is, Ron, put the other chart back up that shows the overall enforcement program. The first thing is that as far as enforcement is concerned, we both look at getting money from the responsible parties up front before we expend fund monies, and in that case, I think we've had an aggressive program. We've gotten over $600 million at nearly 400 sites. Secondly, if we can't get the responsible parties to pay up front, then we go and expend the fund money and go after them after we've completed that fund. And as you can see, that process is just beginning as far as the amount of money we're recovering, but it's beginning to grow. Right-hand chart shows you why. Over there on the final right-hand column, you'll see $300 million that's actually in the cost recovery stage now, which means active cases go into court. That's because of the $460 million that's available for cost recovery, that's sites where work has actually been completed. We've got $300 million of it in the pipeline. We've recovered about $50 million of it. The others are all active cases that are underway. We anticipate, you see sites with viable responsible parties, that line right there. That is the universe of cost recovery money that we'll be going after. It's considerably more than half of the money, about 2/3 of the money that's been expended. Doesn't include sites where we don't have any responsible parties or where we only have bankrupt responsible parties, and it doesn't cover those costs that we can't distribute to a particular site, like our research and development program. But the majority of the money that we've expended will be incorporated into our cost recovery program. Once those once that site work is finished, we have a process for collecting the documentation and then moving the case to the Department of Justice, and that process is picking up speed as we complete more and more sites.
Thank you very much. Now let me turn to a matter extraneous to this committee, Mr. Chairman, but I think it's important to us, and that has to do with chlorofluorocarbons. It just happens that this senator's made a couple of speeches lately on this particular subject, so I'm a little better informed than I usually am on something. And my impression is that you've been a principal architect of the American position as far as CFCs and their reduction or freeze or elimination is concerned in this country and worldwide. And I'm well aware there's another conference, international conference, which began Monday on the same subject. I think the American position, as I understand it, has been a freeze followed by a 95% ultimate reduction worldwide. And I hope correctly I give you credit for being the principal architect of that position. In any event, I'm now hearing rumors that while we've been somewhat persuasive to our industrialized friends across the world, that our negotiators have been instructed to seek only a 20% reduction in CFCs worldwide at the current meeting. And of course, I think that's a regrettable reduction in a policy, if that's true. I hope it isn't, and I hope that you are sticking by your own, if I'm correct, original positions, which I want you to know I think are correct and should be the American position.
Senator, you're absolutely right. The third negotiating session under the United Nations is underway this week. It's a critical session, one that is really getting into the issues that you expressed. Going into that, the United States delegation directions were basically the same as they had had in the past. I will tell you, though, I anticipate that the U.S. position, that the overall position is going to be different from the U.S. position on reductions. I think everybody does, because it's a negotiating session. As you indicated, we started off with a number of other countries that didn't feel like we should go as far as the United States suggested. As a matter of fact, we started off with a number of countries, particularly the heaviest producing countries of chlorofluorocarbons, who felt like that no reduction was required. They've moved. We've begun to bring them closer to our position as they've tried to bring us closer to theirs. It's negotiated. You're fully aware of how that process is conducted. I must tell you, I still feel like that a key element of the ultimate outcome should be to incorporate as many of the chlorofluorocarbon chemicals as possible under this agreement. Also to ensure that there is a reduction of as much as we're able to get automatically incorporated into this agreement, and that goals for further reduction, if we can't get the full reduction, be incorporated as goals that would be subject to further scientific review, and that we set up that scientific review process as an ongoing, routine, regular part of the international community's process. I fully anticipated my 95% wouldn't hold until the end. That doesn't mean I'm not going to push it hard. But I am absolutely convinced that we need to get a reduction incorporated into that agreement that will force the beginning of the development of substitutes for these chemicals that will not offend the stratospheric ozone layer, which is the problem we've got with those existing chemicals. I talked with one of my representatives on the delegation last night in Geneva. He told me he felt the negotiations were going fairly well. He felt that there was additional progress being made as far as movement on the part of other countries towards some of the positions that we felt were very important. But there was still a long way to go this week. I can give you a better feel for the specifics of those negotiations in a few more days.
All right, well, thank you very much. You encouraged me, and I do believe that the tougher our position and the easier it will be to get a negotiated agreement internationally that will have an effective impact on the problem of CFCs and ozone in the stratosphere. So
that's been my position too, Senator. I will say the 20% figure you talked about is a figure that the European community has suggested as a reduction. They started off suggesting no reduction. After a lot of discussion, they've come to 20%. The Japanese have not yet come to that position. They have come to a position where I think they feel a freeze is appropriate, but without an automatic reduction. That's all a part of the negotiation that's going on this week. I'm hopeful that the 95% that we suggested, the freeze level that the Japanese have talked about, 20% that the European community has talked about, somewhere in between all those figures, we're going to come out with a good, required, automatic reduction that would be associated with chlorofluorocarbons.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Stafford. Always a pleasure to have you with us. Look forward to your continued active participation. I want to get back, Lee, to something you said before, that you plan to start 123 RIFs and 99 remedials designs this year. But information from EPA states that as of February 28th, 1987, only 3 RIFs were started, and there were no remedial designs begun. How are you going to meet those targets?
Well, actually, I think I'm glad you asked that question. It's a good example of what's required to start this program up. As you know, we'd gone down to 0 on both those figures, and we got reauthorization after the first quarter began. We've gotten our allocation of money now, and to show you what took place the next month, we've already gotten, by the end of February, nearly 50 remedial investigations underway, nearly 30 designs underway, and 16 of the remedial actions underway. So our projections are we will meet or exceed those targets this year.
Well, what does underway mean? I'm familiar with it in nautical terms.
In this program, it's similar to nautical terms. It means that your ship is sailing.
Leaving the pier,
your captain is at the helm. We have the project running. In other words, we've initiated the project, and the contractor's going forward with the work.
So a transatlantic journey, you're saying that if you left the dock down here in Washington, D.C., by 1 foot, the journey's underway.
And in these projects, in some cases, you're talking about a 1-year project. In other cases, you're talking about a 2-year project. So it depends on the project as to how long the actual work will continue.
Some of these delays, I think, that we are experiencing have to do with the obligating of funds. And the regions didn't get the go-ahead to obligate funds for the first 2 quarters for fiscal year 87 until the middle of February. This late release of this money, coupled with the reauthorization, slowdown, I think, has just further stymied Superfund. Why was the release of the funds so late in coming?
Well, Senator, as you know, Congress didn't complete reauthorization of the law until we didn't get the law signed until the middle of October. The tax collections were not authorized under the law to begin until January. We had to, in fact, go through a process of getting approval from the Treasury Department to borrow the funds to actually begin the process of initiating the program. We went through that process. We got approval from Treasury to do that in advance of any tax collections coming in. And actually, I think we moved expeditiously to get that done. We got the essential elements of the program running quickly, and we got all of the elements of the program running by February, as you indicated.
It wasn't designed, was it, to pace the release of funds in this?
The only design was to move it as fast as we could.
The regions, however, they didn't submit their 87 plans until late December. Why couldn't they have done that before?
Well, we were certainly working on it before that, Senator. Those numbers started coming in December, you're right. But remember, there was a lot of work ongoing, and we were trying to ramp up the entire program. But that process did start in December.
I don't know whether it's symptomatic of the inability to structure this agency to handle a very complex, a very large program that Superfund is. But Lee, I would have to tell you that I have seen delays in several situations that dismay and concern me. One was on the radon demonstration project, where the report was due February 1st, I think it was. We still don't have it. Now we're nudging May here. The IG's report that we referred to earlier. I mean, it's taking an awful long time to get responses back on these things, and I just wonder.
Senator, I understand your concern. I must tell you, though, that I think that we are being responsive. It's not as if, for instance, on the IG's report, that we didn't provide a report. Sure, there was a report. There was a full draft report that the IG had ahead of that date. We're in the process of reviewing that, ongoing discussions with the IG's office. Long before that date occurred, the final report with full review by the IG is the date you're talking about. The radon report, as you know, we've had extensive discussions with the Environment Public Works Committee and hearings on the issue of radon. We're working hard to be responsive to the committee's concerns on radon as well as others. You had hearings on the whole indoor air issue and on radon separately. I think we're trying to
I don't know whether you got a full report on that hearing. Some of your colleagues were obviously there at the moment that we asked about the radon demonstration report. And frankly, it looked like, and by their own admission, that it had slipped, that they weren't the Texas Eastern thing. I mean, we hear this, Texas Eastern, there was an admission that EPA was asleep at the switch. That's almost the exact terminology that was used, Lee. The same thing came through when we talked about the radon demonstration report. Why not? Well, and when is it going to be ready? And frankly, everybody was somewhat embarrassed looking at one another saying, when? Well, we'll submit it. Mr. Barnes was there. We'll submit it for the record. Now, we still don't have that. Is the agency being overtaxed? I mean, you know, it's...
Senator, let me say, I'll say two things. One is EPA has a tremendous workload. It has increased dramatically in the last 3 years as Congress has given us large new authorities under a number of new pieces of legislation like the one we're discussing today, Superfund. So there's no question about that. EPA, I think, does a very good job of responding to that workload. However, EPA is not a perfect agency. There are going to be occasions where deadlines are missed. If you take a look at, for instance, the Superfund law, We had numerous deadlines incorporated. As a matter of fact, we've already hit about 20 of them in the law, and I must tell you we've met nearly every one of them that you gave us to get regulations or guidance out. We've missed a couple. The radon one is an example. But you must admit, we are working hard in the field on a radon program to try to get information to the public, to try to work with the public to deal with the problem. We will work harder to meet your deadlines, but there are going to be occasions where we miss them.
There is no intent to suggest less than full effort. I think, Lee, it does go back to an earlier point where you and I discussed the ramping up phase. It took a long time for the White House to issue the executive order. We've seen funding requests at less than the authorized levels. And I just would not like to see us constantly reviewing missed deadlines, because again, whether it's a missed deadline on project A, B, or C, these are symptoms at times of other things, coupled, frankly, with, and there's no one that would suggest that you or your agency has an easy job. Very complicated, and we're always treading new waters, and I think with these, with the conditions we put into SARA, the ramping up experience of this gigantic proposal. But frankly, when we look at that with the insufficient cost accounting targets from the private, from the contractors, some questions about recovery, which we'll try to deal with in the few minutes we have left, suggest to me that this ship isn't fully staffed yet, that though we have a good captain, and we have some very good first mates here, if we're going to stay nautical, that there are large parts of the crew that are either untrained or where the process is not yet fully developed. And,
Senator, there's no question that we're putting on a large number of additional staff, many of them in our regional offices where the management requirements for site work is. It's a matter of fact, if you look at this year and next year funding request, we will nearly double the size of the Superfund staff, and we will have nearly 3,000 federal employees managing the Superfund program. So there's no question that we're staffing up. As I indicated, a number of them are in contract management, contract oversight. But the program is a far larger program than we ran the first 5 years. We've also learned a lot during that 5-year period of time about how to manage it better. So yes, it's going to require additional people. There's no question about that.
One thing that concerns me is whether we were going to become a training ground for staffing for the private sector. And I would urge you to think about that. Maybe there ought to be a prohibition. We've seen it in various parts of government. Certainly the military now has a very detailed process by where those who deal with a contractor, I think, are at least prohibited from going to work for that contractor in a given period of time. We have it in New Jersey in another area in the gaming business, which is a big part of the state's tourist business now. You're just not allowed to go to work with someone that you've had dealings with. And it's an inhibitor for a career choice. I know that. It's difficult, but we're creating an industry. The industry is created not by EPA, but by the pollution problem.
Well, Senator, you're right. That is an issue, and we've spent a good bit of time on that issue. I mean, it's not unlike the same issue we faced in our construction grants program providing funding for building sewage treatment facilities. We've managed that program, $2.5 to $4 billion a year program, for a number of years. We not only have to look at ensuring that we have good, well-qualified people and that we retain them. And so we spend a good bit of time looking at how we do that. Some of them are going to work for the private side as well. Frankly, we want their people to be well-qualified also. And if some of them are people who have worked with us, then they will be well-qualified. We don't want to see us as a training ground for them, and we don't think that's what's happening. We have to work on that constantly to retain our people. but we're going to have some of them who go to work for the other side,
Well,
the contractors. There's no question about that, but we get benefit
I'd urge
from
you
that.
to give that some thought, and I'd like a response from you, because in addition to the fact that we don't want to, on the mandate that we have for Superfund EPA, to be simply a Department of Education facility. I mean, that's not our mission. The other thing is that worries me a lot, I must tell you, is what happens when someone goes from EPA to the private sector and helps them design contracts and opportunities to do business. This is, after all, a huge piece of business that's out there. You know, when you start talking about billions of dollars over a period of 5 years, it's a very inviting place for a new career. And it is different than sewage treatment facilities, because there's lots of that going around now. We're going to discover, it's my prediction, I'm sure you'll agree, that as we go ahead with this cleanup process, we're going to discover a whole new series of things. We'll discover new technologies, we'll discover new techniques, new processes by which we do this. So it's an uncharted field, and there lies, in my view, a lot of economic opportunity, as well as a lot of opportunity for funny business if we're not careful. And I wouldn't like to see someone who's inside the agency doing their own assessment and saying, okay, if I go to work for you, Mr. Contractor, I know where the soft spots are, and I know how to pick off the good parts of this thing. Obviously, there is some special knowledge. Anyway, it's something to think.
Senator, the points you're making are absolutely correct as far as the kind of vigilance we have to have on both our own operations and on contract operations. It is why, I know when you question our Inspector General, you will find that we have asked him to pay special attention with increased personnel to this program. So, in fact, the potential for fraud, waste, abuse is not realized under this program.
Lee, I know you're in a hurry to go. I just want to get a couple of things here with you. Audits show that some states don't have adequate documentation by which they're accounting for or justifying costs incurred at Superfund sites. This ties into a separate issue, and that is the cost recovery issue. Now, I am concerned about that, because without adequate documentation, EPA's ability to recover costs from responsible parties is certainly stymied. Not only will the fund not be replenished, but exactly what we didn't intend to happen is going to happen. That is, we'll be paying for the unlawful, health-threatening actions of responsible parties. You've established a national program to develop a consistency by states in the documentation of these costs, have you not? Or if you haven't, are you?
We have. I would say in the cost recovery program, one of the areas that we need to continue to work to improve is that portion of the cost that the state managed. And it covers the issue that we've talked about on state cooperative agreements, as well as the cost recovery issue. What we have to ensure is that that state has the same kind of record-keeping capability for maintaining site-specific costs that we have, so we can combine those two records when we go to recover cost at a site. And we're working to strengthen that.
Lee, the IG's report on EPA Superfund recovery program is critical of the agency's efforts. Now, I heard what you said there, and we looked very carefully at all the charts. But according to IG, 5 years into the program, we've only had $14 million recovered. We know that there have been settlements to a fairly large extent, but that's not cost recovery. 14 million out of funds that have been obligated to the tune of 1.3 billion is a fairly dismal record. And particularly if that's an accurate measure of what we can expect over the next 5 years. Now, you do extend your projections to 88 and talk about 50 million. Is that expected to, that might be recovered? That's about...
Through today, through first quarter of this year, Senator, we've recovered about $50 million. The figure you're using was from fiscal year 85.
Right. And The 50 million, you say through the first quarter, okay, I'm trying to eyeball that chart there, through the first quarter still leaves us with about 2% of the roughly 1.8 billion, because the 1.3 did end with last a year and a half ago. That's not a lot.
Well, I think that the answer to that is I've stated, Senator, no, that's about 3% of the $1.8 billion. However, of the sites that have been finished and of the sites where we're going forward with cost recovery action, we've got about 65% of the money that we have either recovered or we have in the court process. And we'll have the rest of it in the process this year. We're moving forward. As a site finishes, as we finish work at a site, the data's pulled together, the case is prepared, and we go to court. Many of these sites, however, take years.
I'm sorry.
Many of the sites take years to complete. So you, in fact, will see that cost recovery curve at the bottom go up.
If we look at that, the color chart there, we have the column that says sites with viable PRPs. What's that sum?
That means we've been able to identify, the sum?
Yeah.
I don't have the figure. It's about, you have it, Ron? 1.4 billion.
1.4. Now, out of that, you're saying that we've initiated $300 million worth of action.
Right.
We've gotten
50.
Something has to happen to speed up the process if
well,
we're
the thing that speeds up the process is you finish the site work. You can't start the cost recovery action until you finish the site work. So the $1.4 billion with viable PRPs, about $460 million of it is where we finish site work. And we're moving the cost recovery actions on that. So you've got about $1 billion, but the site work is actually not fully completed, so we haven't started the site recovery action.
The Inspector General reported that once you have, you're at a point where you're negotiating cost recovery, it's been taking 9 months to negotiate the settlement. Is that?
Well, but Senator, I don't think that's unusual when you think about the judicial process and moving a site through the judicial process to actually reach settlement.
We're talking now about the negotiation part of the settlement. We're saying that here's a party that is essentially identified with a responsibility. Doesn't that sound like a long time?
Can I just comment too, Senator? I think one of the things that's happening in some of those older cases is we didn't have as good a documentation as we have now. And there was more contention perhaps in some of those earlier cases. But certainly when you finish a case like this, there's going to be some dialogue with the PRPs on what's recoverable and what isn't. So I might also add that we're trying to speed up in the sense of...
What's your goal?
I'm sorry?
What's the goal for negotiating these settlements?
Well, we don't have a specific goal. I think, as Lee said, 9 months doesn't seem terribly long to me, but I think we can do better.
You reported a 60-day objective. Is that, are we...
Yeah, that's the objective we use.
Those are the kind of time frames we're putting in place. But let me tell you, Senator, what you're dealing with here, as far as an enforcement action is concerned, is your toughest cases. The cases where you were going to get your money up front, you got in that top line up there, blue.
Settlement.
These are the responsible parties who wouldn't settle with you. The responsible parties who have said all along, no, it's not my site. I'm not going to pay for it. You don't have the documentation to make me pay for it. So you've come to the end of the line now with these people that you're getting your money back from. In fact, the settlement process, both time delay is because of that, but it's also because of the fact that you're dealing with EPA, Department of Justice, and the judicial system in trying to work through a settlement negotiation.
Thank you very much, Lee, and your colleagues for being with us. There is a forthrightness about you which I respect. I would have to tell you that we at times disagree on some of the results as well as some of the goals and objectives, and I think my concerns are more objective than you would agree to, based on the fact that we see these incidents of slippage, whether it's based on the differences expressed by the IG or simply what I would have to tell you as a former corporate executive of a fairly complicated company and a big company, that the procedures to me seem less than adequate. I know that that you strive for continuous improvement there, and that goes for all three of you and the people I've met from EPA. To this point, I don't think that the systems are adequate for the task, and you don't need my urging you to get on with that. I know how hard everybody does work there, but we are at a point in time when the job can be done more effectively, and I hope that we'll see the results of your efforts now, because there's an awful lot of money out there. It's very inviting. It's a targeted opportunity for lots of people, and we have the responsibility to the citizens of our country to do it better. Thank you very much.
Senator, I couldn't agree with you more that we have that responsibility, and I'd like to say that we appreciate working with you. The kind of questions you're asking, the kind of oversight you intend to have with this subcommittee of the program, I think is excellent, very strong, and we look forward to working with you to ensure that, in fact, we all can say we have a very strong program.
We'll give you that opportunity. Thank you very much. Next witness. Next witness is Mr. John Martin. He's the Inspector General of the Environmental Protection Agency, and we're pleased to have you with us. Mr. Martin, you've had that assignment since 1983, and you came to the agency like Lee Thomas to help bail it out when it was a leaky ship. And prior to your service at EPA, you served as the Assistant IG for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And you've been with the FBI and served in some local government positions. You certainly, Mr. Martin, have experience for the job, and your Superfund audits are an example of that experience. You pull no punches, and you've made what I think are wise recommendations. The agency is implementing many of them. We are anxious to hear from you, and we compliment you on your diligence. That's a responsibility, and I think it must have been pleasant for you to hear that the administrator agreed with the zeal and with the thoroughness of the job that you're doing. It's good to hear that. I would have expected nothing less from Mr. Thomas, but we urge you to continue with that diligence. You have a responsibility for a very important area of responsibility for the environment in this country as well as to the citizens. So we're pleased to have you with us. I would ask you, all three of you, to stand and take the oath. The oath, rather. You swear that the testimony that you give will to this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes.
Please. Mr. Martin, if you would go on with your testimony, we look forward to hearing it.
Well, thank you, Senator. Let me first introduce the two people at the table with me. On my left is my Deputy Inspector General, Donald Kirkendall, who is my principal assistant in dealing with all the matters in the Inspector General's office. And on my right is Mr. Ernest Bradley, who is my Assistant Inspector General for Audit. He is responsible for all the audit operations of the IG's office around the country. If I could just highlight my remarks and ask that my full statement be included in the record. There are four main areas that I'd like to just briefly go over. The first is our work in the emergency response cleanup service contracts. Second, cooperative agreements. Third, the work we've done concerning on-scene coordinators in EPA. And finally, cost recovery issues. We issued an audit report last September on EPA's emergency response cleanup services, the contracts of which were awarded in 1983 and 1984. We found that the IRCS contracts with a potential value of $185 million allowed contractors excessive markups over costs. We used the term markup to mean the difference between estimated actual costs and the rates billed to EPA. For labor costs, we found markups averaged 40%.
When overtime rates were billed, markups in some cases were even a lot higher. For example, at one site, EPA paid over $20,000 for security guards, which cost the contractor a little more than $8,000, a markup of 146%. As shown on the first chart, we found markups on equipment items ranged from an average of 143% on monthly rates to an average of 321% on hourly rates. For example, a simple trash pump was billed to EPA at a rate of $16 an hour, or $945 a month. The contractor originally bought the pump for a little more than $500 and depreciated it for 5 years. No repair or maintenance costs were recorded for it. The contractor received $4,000 at just one site for the use of this $500 pump. Since the pump had an estimated life of 5 years, the contractor may well have received substantial additional amounts for the pump at other sites. In another instance, EPA was charged $58 a day for the use of a pickup truck that the subcontractor just leased for $16 a day. This was a net markup to him of 262% over actual costs. A number of problems contributed to these excess markups. The massive size and stringent response requirements of the IRC's contracts severely limited the number of companies which submitted proposals. The limited number of offerers and their contractual interrelationships and the use of price analysis instead of cost analysis made it difficult for the agency to obtain reasonable rates. The use of fixed rates for most labor and equipment categories, including subcontracted items, allowed contractors to recover many times the actual cost for some items. Fixed rate contracts are not cost effective unless the fixed rates are reasonable and reflective of the circumstances involved. The factors which limited the IRC's procurement, restrictions in the RFP, and difficult contract specifications undoubtedly affected the contract price structure and the way contractors did their business under the contracts. In response to our audit report, the agency has adopted a new contract strategy for the removal program to be implemented over 3 years. This strategy involves going from 4 large zones to as many as 25 by the end of 1988, plus a number of competitive procurements for cleanup of individual sites. These contracts will be tailored to different degrees of urgency. The agency has shifted to rely more on a cost reimbursement payment term and limit the use of fixed rates. It's also relying more on cost analysis rather than price analysis to obtain reasonable rates. In order to provide day-to-day oversight and management of the contracts, the agency is placing contract specialists in EPA's regional offices. The agency has laid out a comprehensive plan that represents a total rethinking of the procurement process for cleanup contracts. If the agency implements all the initiatives contained in its strategy, we believe that the process for procurement of immediate response contracts will be greatly improved. We're going to continue to monitor the agency's implementation of the strategy and evaluate its effectiveness. Now, the next, cooperative agreements. We've conducted 2 major types of audits of state-led cleanups under cooperative agreements awarded by EPA. We've reviewed both the EPA regional oversight of the states and have audited the states themselves, which have claimed costs under the agreements. The first type of audit looked at EPA regional management of cooperative agreements with the states. While specific problems varied, we consistently found that the agency had not adequately monitored the states receiving Superfund cooperative agreements to ensure that federal requirements were met and that objectives of the agreement were achieved in a timely manner. For example, we found that EPA project officers lacked adequate training in the area of procurement and contract administration and did not require the states to take necessary action for deficiencies that they had identified. We found that EPA project officers did not take effective action to ensure timely completion of remedial investigations and feasibility studies, which were taking more than 2 years to complete. The regions were not also receiving required state progress reports and not following up on reports when they didn't get them. As an example of what one state was doing, they were charging costs which were not supported by any documentation. For instance, 6 employees were charging more than 100% of the total time they worked to only 3 EPA cooperative agreements. Several of these same employees who were charging over 100% of their time to EPA were also responsible for other state programs during the same time period. The regions we reviewed responded to our reports with planned corrective actions. Again, as with IRCS, we're going to make sure that these deficiencies are corrected. In addition to reviewing EPA's regional oversight of state cleanups, we've performed external audits of specific Superfund cooperative agreements. In fiscal 1986, we issued 9 such reports, and we issued 6 in the first half of fiscal 87. As the second chart shows, we audited $22 million of costs claimed under 15 cooperative agreements. We questioned $1.2 million as being unallowable for federal reimbursement and set aside another $6.4 million for further agency review. This illustrates the fact that we had problems with almost a third of the costs that we reviewed. Some of the deficient areas we identified related to poor documentation of labor, travel, and laboratory costs, and the state's accounting systems were often not adequate to record costs by specific sites. However, the biggest single problem we encountered was the state procurement system. Most states just didn't have a written procurement manual which addressed EPA's requirements, and a number of states did not always conduct or document required cost analysis to determine that the costs they paid were reasonable. Some states didn't adequately document the justification for selection of the procurement method they used, or to evaluate offerers based on clear criteria which were outlined in the request for proposals. Some states entered into contracts with prohibited cost plus percentage of cost clauses. Federal regulations prohibit these kinds of contracts, which add on a fixed percent to direct costs, and thus encourage contractors to maximize rather than minimize their costs. EPA has recognized state procurement deficiencies as a national problem. It's issued a manual and offered training to state personnel to address the problem. In response to our audit reports on these issues, a number of states have prepared procurement manuals and are generally working to improve their operations. Again, we're going to follow up to make sure the problems we've identified have been corrected. Concerning removal actions, during the past 3 years, we conducted unannounced on-site audits of removal actions. These audits determine the adequacy of the controls exercised by EPA's on-scene coordinators. To date, we've issued 14 final reports on such audits, covering 18 different sites. We've generally found that EPA's on-scene coordinators have not exercised adequate controls to ensure that EPA pays only for the services it receives. Documentation has generally been incomplete and inadequate, and internally inconsistent in a number of instances. At several sites, we found clearly unallowable charges were billed to EPA and approved by the on-scene coordinator. For example, at one site, we found that a contractor billed 12 people for 2 days' work when no work was performed at the site. Protective clothing was charged for 15 days, during which employees did not work, and equipment was charged when it was not being used. Partly as a result of our audit reports on removal actions, as well as the IRCS report, the agency established a work group on management support for Superfund's on-scene coordinators. A final work group report was issued on March 27th of this year. It made a number of recommendations to improve administrative support for on-scene coordinators and to institute a formal internal control review program. The recommendations included the establishment of administrative support units for on-scene coordinators and other training in administrative areas. We intend to continue to perform unannounced on-site audits, and we'll be able to evaluate the effectiveness of the agency's initiatives in this regard. The final chart that we have illustrates what we have done in the area of cost recovery. In September of 1986, we issued a report on EPA's efforts to have potential responsible parties clean up hazardous waste sites or pay for the cleanup done by the federal government. As this chart shows, overall we found that as of September 30, 1985, EPA had obligated $1.3 million from the trust fund. The agency had negotiated 84 cost recovery cases totaling $26 million. This resulted in 72 cases being settled for $14.6 million, of which $14 million had been collected as of that time. Now, there has been much discussion between us and the agency over the appropriate ways of presenting data on the agency's enforcement program. We recognize that there are different methods of presenting such data. Just last week, in response to the cost recovery audit report, the agency presented several other ways to evaluate its collection activities. One method included identifying the universe of sites potentially ready for cost recovery and then examining the cost recovery activity initiated against those sites. Another method compared the amount sought by the agency versus the amount settled with the responsible parties. These alternative methodologies for measuring the success of the program and the dollar values and percentages presented raise a number of questions. We're still in the process of evaluating the agency's response, but it appears that the agency is viewing cost recovery activities from a different perspective. In our analysis, we wanted to show the simple overall impact on the trust fund. That is, of $1.3 billion obligated, the agency had actual collections of only $14 million, or a cost recovery ratio of 1.1%. Unless the trust fund is replenished by cost recoveries, the agency's ability to clean up hazardous waste sites will be diminished. We found that EPA also was not aggressively pursuing cost recovery action against potential responsible parties where funds expended for removal activities were under $200,000. As of September 30, 85, we found 182 removal actions under $200,000, which totaled $6 million, where cost recovery actions were not being pursued. We also calculated that potentially over $60 million could be lost to the trust fund in the next 20 years if a concerted effort to recover costs for removal actions under $200,000 is not made. In summary, as we've talked about here today, our audit work has shown that EPA has some real problems in administering the Superfund program. At the same time, however, the agency has worked cooperatively with us in developing aggressive plans of action for alleviating the identified problems. While there may occasionally be some disagreement between us and the agency about the details of any individual audit report, there is maximum cooperation in getting problems corrected. The EPA staff, from the administrator on down, understand and support our role in reviewing program operations and have demonstrated their willingness to work cooperatively with us to obtain needed operational improvements. You can be sure that we're going to continue to work closely with the agency to make the Superfund program function as effectively, economically, and efficiently as possible. Now, my staff and I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have concerning these issues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. In your testimony and my statement, we both referred to the obvious incidents of major problems with overcharges. We talked about the 2-inch trash pump. You also heard the administrator say that you can find isolated examples of abuse, but that in general there was a better handle on things than appeared to be. Certainly you don't confirm that view in your comments. And one way of examining the total is to look at its parts, like we have these single incidents, and see whether they do run consistently through the process. Is it fair to say that your audit was thorough enough, your review was thorough enough, that you didn't find these matters so infrequently as to confirm Mr. Thomas's judgment that these were just isolated incidents. I mean, you challenged the whole process, the cost analysis, the pricing, etc. Is it fair to say that these incidents are just representative of a general condition, or would you not go that far?
The audit office undertook a major effort in order to study the contractors and the individual delivery orders that we did audit. In many cases, they had to go in and reconstruct an entire company's records in order to come up with the figures that they have been able to produce for the audit report that we issued. Because of the tremendous amount of work that involved, we were not able to do numerous specific delivery orders. However, we chose delivery orders that we believed in the end of our work would adequately represent the total universe of the work that EPA did. Now, we did not approach this from a statistical point of view, so we're not talking about a situation where we can talk about statistical validity or anything like that. But we're confident that the work that we did adequately represents the real situation that EPA faced in its administration of IRC's contracts.
It would seem to me that if the basic record keeping isn't there at the contractor level, if it isn't there at the state level, which is also an observation that you make in your report, that finding problems, finding overcharges, finding abuses would not be a particularly difficult assignment if the process isn't in place. If the records aren't kept, then it's pretty obvious to me as a former businessman, and I assume that to those responsible for audit and review, that you're going to have lots of this stuff occur. It's not to suggest that contractors are stealing or that there are attempts to defraud, but certainly, even perhaps without knowledge, a contractor is going to be able to make these charges and abuse at least the good taste, a good judgment, if not violate the law. We have seen enough of this that suggests that we need more management from EPA to ensure that these funds are being appropriately expended. Do you agree with that?
Well, Senator, that really is the entire thrust of our report, particularly as it deals with the IRC's contracts. And as I said in my testimony, the agency has moved miles ahead in an effort to do exactly what you're suggesting. That is, really get a handle on what it costs contractors to do the kind of work we're asking them to do, and to make the contracts more reasonable. Even though, as Mr. Porter and the administrator spoke about earlier, for example, when you talk about one of the zones that we talked about in the IRC's contracts, a zone that extends all the way from Louisiana to Alaska, even though there are subcontractors within that zone, it became, I think, extremely difficult for any contractor to agree to take on a zone of that size. I mean, I think it would be a substantial undertaking for anyone. So a major point of our audit report was that EPA hemmed itself in by the way it structured its own contracts. Then it coupled that with the fact that it just simply never had adequate information from the contractors or from experience to determine what realistic rates should be. And so in the end, when you had so few bidders, there were only in the end 7 bidders for the 4 zones. So EPA had very little choice to pick from. And in this situation, they found themselves, I think, agreeing to rates that simply allowed contractors, as I said in my testimony, extensively high markups.
I must tell you that I'm always suspicious of companies that don't keep records, particularly when so much of their income depends on personnel, as contrasted to manufacturing, contrasted to other kinds of service business. When there's a lot of personnel involvement, equipment involvement, those things, very measurable things, it raises concerns for me because it's known in the past that that often obscures income, profits, taxes, etc. And for people, for companies not to have basic records about where their costs are that they're able to produce certainly is a violation of good management, if again, if not something even more suspect than that. EPA's come a long way, as you say, but the fact is that there was a lot of money that was spent in the last 6 years, last 7 years, since 1980. To hear about inadequate systems or inadequate supervision concerns me. I mean, at what point is the job so complicated that it's unmanageable? And are we, as some suggest, just throwing money at this thing? I don't believe that that's necessary. And again, we see EPA talking about its improvements in systems, cost analysis, and so forth. And we like to see that. It does suggest to me that there was a period of time before when not enough attention was given to these things because by admission of the fact that they're improving, it says that they weren't good enough. And then when we couple that with the incidence of overcharges, then we've got ourselves a problem. How about the lack of ability to recover from polluters? Don't we have to provide perhaps the court or at least some kind of an arbitrator documentation that says this is what it costs to clean up this mess? I would think that that's called for. If we can't supply the supporting documentation for which we paid and which we seek to recover, then how can we justify the request for reimbursement?
Well, Senator, we're often called on to verify, in fact, the costs of a particular cleanup. We do, sometimes by request even of the Justice Department, do particular audits of certain sites to verify what the costs actually were in cleaning up a site. And you're absolutely right that in the absence of completely verifiable records, you can bet that responsible parties or a defendant in a suit is definitely going to object to paying anything that we can't document, or the state, if they did the work, can't document as being costs that are either directly or indirectly attributable to a site. So your point is exactly correct.
You're talking in your testimony about fixed rates, and that's also a nomenclature terminology that gets mixed. I think of a fixed contract as something that has a ceiling on top of it, and underneath the costs for specific functions become less of a concern. But when you use the term fixed rates, you're talking about a fixed rate for labor, a fixed rate for equipment, fixed rate for materials, without a ceiling on those expenditures. What would be the incentive for a contractor to get the work done in a hurry or to save money if it's essentially a time and materials contract?
Well, I think you've hit an obvious nail on the head, Senator. As Mr. Messner spoke earlier, except for their general reputation and their desire perhaps to do good work, other than that, they have very little incentive because they're going to get paid for whatever they bill us as long as that, the work was actually performed, and we can't prove that they're fraudulently billing us. But as long as people were on the site, equipment was on the site, the pace that you work at and to get a job done could certainly vary, and I see very little incentive.
Then can't really tell about the reasonableness of those rates, even though those rates are used for billing, if we don't have adequate cost analysis or records within the contractor.
That's correct.
I want to just talk about the cost recovery percentages. How did you heard the dispute? You were in the audience about how much progress had been made. We talked about $14 million up to 1985, September 30. Talked about the percentage that the agency felt was, or the opportunity that was available. It's still a pretty small target, is it not? Even, or a small result compared to the funds expended so far. We looked at $50 million to this point out of a total of some 400 million opportunity, and out of $1.8 billion expended, 2.5%, some number like that. What do you think would have to be done to improve that ratio?
Well, Senator, the agency, as late as about a week ago, was really unable to provide
done to improve that ratio?
Well, Senator, the agency, as late as about a week ago, was really unable to provide to us many of the statistics which we're hearing today. They have done a great deal of work to be able to pull together meaningful statistics to illustrate their success in the cost recovery effort. We have not had an opportunity to review those statistics ourselves, so I would have a hard time commenting specifically on the numbers that have been provided because we really have not had a chance to study them. As far as the basic theory is concerned, I think my concern is that, as we expressed in our report, is much the same that you've expressed, and even GAO did a similar report on cost recovery not too long ago, where they looked at just direct costs expended at certain sites, and then they analyzed the recovery of that. So we didn't get into overhead costs or whatever, and they found a recovery rate of about 4%. So it seems like all of us seem to be zeroing in when we look at what's actually being recovered into the fund in a cost recovery action. We're coming out with some very low percentages. And that was the simple point of our comment. And it's absolutely true that there, as I said in my testimony, that there are many different ways to analyze statistics. And the way many of the ideas that the agency has are certainly valid. Examining sites that there was no expectation that you could ever recover any money from. Talking about certain types of overhead written into the agency's program, like in research and development, where there was just simply no way to identify with particular sites. That's understandable that we're never going to recover all that money. But when we talk about percentages as low as 1%, 2%, 4%, that was really the thrust of our report, that we just thought it's really important that we put a great deal of emphasis on adequately replenishing the fund. A simple example of what to do is where we pointed out that the agency really isn't doing anything with sites that cost under $200,000. And, you know, that may not be a large amount of money in comparison to the federal budget, but those amounts are adding up fairly quickly, and over time, we just see a tremendous loss of money to the fund.
Mr. Messner, you're sitting there and hearing this, and you're still under the obligation of the oath. I wonder, would you want to respond to a question about the lateness of information developed regarding these recoveries so that the IG would have had an opportunity to work with them at a little bit earlier date, not...
Mr. Chairman, it's not often I get a chance to replace the chief auditor of the agency at the table, so I'll take the opportunity, and thank you. It's really a matter of presentation. Some of our colleagues have been before the committees of Congress in the last several months presenting the data. As the questions have been posed, the explanations of the data have been refined. I think taking a stark left-hand column that says you had $1.5 billion and then a stark right-hand column that you only collected infinitesimal portion of that doesn't fully represent the dilemma of management in the agency. And what Lee Thomas tried to do was to take those two stacks, those two columns, and to begin to really hone in and refine our explanation of what we're after. I think the American people are getting a good deal. I think they're going to get a better deal as the momentum of this program develops. And I think that as the IG has said, he continuously monitors this program. You're going to see the curve on that chart go up. It will never go up to the maximum of the total of the program because of the reasons stated. So our attention is riveted on this issue both by your interest, by the interest of the Inspector General, and by the other checks and balances in the system.
Thanks, Mr. Messner. I would say to you this, that the hot breath of the IG apparently does produce some results that standard management practices have not produced.
Well, I find working with the Inspector General in this agency both stimulating and positive.
And energizing, huh?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Mr. Bradley.
Chairman, I doubt that I could let that pass without a comment. There is just no question that Mr. Messner, once he has seized on the issues that we've raised in our various reports, has just been a tremendous driving force in working in his operation, because he is responsible for that area of contracting to work on improvements. There's just no doubt about that.
We're inclined to give credit where due, but I also do say that if the horses shouldn't have to have been whipped so hard to pull the load if they were doing their work before as diligently as we would like to see. That's not to say that it's an easy assignment by a long shot. You talked about the 200,000 and unders. I think you said there were $6 million in the possibility there right now, and that it could go substantially higher. The agency counters that in many cases it would expend more in effort than it might recover. How do you respond to that?
Well, for example, the agency pointed out to us that of the there were about 182 sites that we looked at in our work, and they told us that about 39% of those, some 72 sites, had only had amounts expended of under $10,000. However, this only represented, in dollars, about 5% of the total expended on all the sites we looked at. So in other words, 39% of the sites represented only 5% of the dollars. A lot of the sites have a substantial amount of money in the $200,000 range. And there is just, in our view, no way that the agency can ignore them. Now, perhaps it is not practical to go a full legal route in terms of Justice Department and court suits. But it also appears that there may be options that the agency could consider through a less involved debt collection type of process. And it's just very important, though, in our view, that they not be written off, just automatically written off as non-collectible, because individually the amount of money may not be that large.
I wonder if it's possible to privatize that collection process.
Well, I'm not sure the
Probably.
legal ramifications of it, but it's an interesting idea. There have been various efforts in the government, I think, to attempt debt collection of different kinds.
You say that there's potentially as much as $60 million worth of recovery in the next 20 years if there's a concerted effort to recover the amounts for sites that have a less than $200,000 tag on them. You also use the analogy of these recoveries to the national debt. That's nothing compared to the national debt is significant, I can tell you. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work just as diligently to collect, if we can, those amounts under $200,000. Very often it's easier, I think, to collect, or at least to identify the polluters in those cases, because that's not usually a multi-organizational creation. It's often the result of one company's activity or one individual's activity. In your testimony, you stated that alternative methods and dollar values and percentages presented by the agency related to cost recovery raised a number of questions. Might you elaborate on that for just a moment, please?
Well, there are questions in the sense that I already spoke about, Senator, that we simply have not had time, because of when the data has been presented to us, to really examine the basis by which the agency has made the calculations.
Okay, we'd ask you to examine that and try to respond to us, at least in general form, if you can.
Fine, well, we'll certainly do that, Senator.
Regarding the state co-op agreements, the non-competition factor seems to be a serious, significant one there. Have you found that states award contracts without competition? I think you said that in your testimony.
Yes, that is a problem. There are a number of more or less routine procurement kinds of violations that we routinely found as we examined state cooperative agreements. I, like the administrator, believe that it's an outstanding way to do our business, but at the same time, we can't enter into the agreement with a state that is not ready or doesn't have the means available to it to fulfill the agreement. And many times, again, we're talking about fairly complicated procurement practices, or in some cases, I think, pretty standard practices. But there are a whole variety of issues that relate all to procurement that we found problems in the States.
States sometimes give contracts to the non-low bidder?
Yes, we found that actually.
Is that of and by itself a poor practice?
Well, of course, as I understand the procurement system, there is no absolute requirement that the low bidder be selected. It's usually phrased the lowest qualified bidder. And in those cases, you could get into some dispute over the awarding officials' interpretation as to who was the lowest responsible bidder.
Lowest qualified. If we have the lowest qualified bidder in the process, are there instances there where states don't award the contracts to the lowest qualified bidder?
In our view, or we wouldn't have raised the issue if we've found absolute assurance that in cases where the lowest bidder was not selected, that there were absolutely clear and prevailing reasons why that wouldn't happen. In our view, though, bidders who were qualified were passed over in favor of others, and course, there were reasons given, but it's again a question of dispute as to whether the reasons are legitimate or not.
Do you find states agreeing to modifications of contracts, change orders, without producing adequate justification?
Yes, Senator, that's another situation. Again, we're back to what should be standard good government kinds of practices. And when those are lacking, when they're not available for whatever reason, they either don't exist in the state system or they're simply abused, you get into problems. And that is, again, another clear example of what we found.
So then, if those weaknesses are abundant, then we would have to ask EPA to establish a process by where they're more demanding from the states for reimbursement if they're going to.
That's exactly correct. We did, as I said in my testimony, principally three audits of EPA regions from that point of view, that we think they need to be more aggressive and more demanding, and making sure that, again, the basic kinds of good government procurement practices are followed. And if they do that, sure, there are going to be problems, but I think they're going to be diminished a great deal. They certainly won't be to the extent like we've already found, where some states didn't have any practices that were related to the kind of work we want done. I mean, they're just totally non-existent. That shouldn't occur.
Is this consistent with those states' procurement practices generally? Are you saying that they violated their own normal procedures in the case of these cleanup responses, or are some of these states, have you found, not have routine procurement?
I would say, Senator, that basically we found that their activities were not in accordance with federal practices. Mr. Bradley may want to comment a little further on.
Well, a couple of states we looked at actually had an adequate state procurement system, but the environmental agency within the state had not adopted the state's procurement system itself, which would have met a lot of our.
So you think it was just isolated to the environmental function? I mean, I'm just curious now that you raised the question. Do some states not have procurement procedures that resemble ours, or that are orderly and so forth? Is there laxity in lots of states? I'm not going to ask you to identify the states, but is that?
Well, again, we didn't look at the overall state's procurement system, but we did find that the states that we looked at were not following a state's procurement system because in those instances.
I was just curious about the other. Thank you. On the on-scene coordinator problem, the on-scene coordinators, according to EPA's report, haven't done well in the administrative area, and documentation has certainly not been one of their strong points, and this affects cost recovery. If you don't document the cost, something we talked about before, you can't successfully sue the responsible party for reimbursement. Do you think that EPA has had difficulty with cost recovery efforts because of poor financial, technical, or other documentation due in part by the inadequately trained or inadequately staffed on-scene coordinators?
There's just no question about it, Mr. Chairman. As I said in my testimony, we have done what we call these unannounced site visits, where our auditors just show up on the scene and really get into those individual books and records right at the site to make sure everything's being handled properly. And it is, without question, almost a universal problem that the on-scene coordinator does not have either adequate training, experience, or interest in adequately maintaining the record side of the work. They are extremely, I think, dedicated people who really want to get the job done and have a site cleaned up. but that, in their minds, oftentimes does not necessarily equate with good record keeping. I believe that the agency here again has really taken a giant step forward in exploring a concept of business manager or offering some type of support to the on-scene coordinator for the business side of the site. And that will be a tremendous help, because there's just no question that those people, as interested as they are in the cleanup, don't really have the same interest in the records of the cleanup.
So we have, management has to stimulate that interest.
Absolutely.
And there are various ways to do that. Well, we thank you, Mr. Martin, and your colleagues from the Inspector General's side of things. We, again, say to all of the witnesses that we think this was a very positive review. We recognize that steps are being taken to improve the process, but by the same time, we have to admit that there have been weaknesses in the procedures that encouraged some exceptional problems in terms of reimbursement, in terms of costing, in terms of our ability to try to get our cost recovery programs underway. We'll continue our oversight responsibility. I sought this assignment because I'm very interested in the cleaner environment. Superfund 2, as I call it, I think was a very well-designed program, quite well-funded. We are sometimes at odds with the agency about pace. We are not at odds about mission. But no matter what the pace is, it has to be moved along with efficiency and effectiveness in terms of management. You have helped us strengthen that management obligation, and as I said to Mr. Thomas and his associates, we think that there is a good, earnest effort at trying to run things better. They have been candid with me on many occasions, saying that, look, something's gone awry here. We have had a problem. We aren't up to where we ought to be. We have had a little sleepiness at the switch in a couple places. That's not an admission of failure of the total program. It is an admission of the fact that this is quite a broad learning experience, but we are going to continue to apply the pressures to get that the pace up to the level it ought to be in order to manage this program. We thank you all for being here, and that adjourns this
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You've been watching a hearing on implementation of the Superfund before the Senate Environment Subcommittee on the Superfund and Environmental Oversight. If you'd like more information, you can contact the Superfund and Environmental Oversight Subcommittee in room 410 of the Dirksen Office Building, Washington, D.C., 20510.
competition factor seems to be a serious, significant one there. Have you found that states award contracts without competition? I think you said that in your testimony.
Yes, that is a problem. There are a number of more or less routine procurement kinds of violations that we routinely found as we examined state cooperative agreements. I, like the administrator, believe that it's an outstanding way to do our business, but at the same time, we can't enter into the agreement with a state that is not ready or doesn't have the means available to it to fulfill the agreement. And many times, again, we're talking about fairly complicated procurement practices, or in some cases, I think, pretty standard practices. But there are a whole variety of issues that relate all to procurement that we found problems with.
States sometimes give contracts to the non-low bidder.
Yes, we found that actually.
Is that of and by itself a poor practice?
Well, of course, as I understand the procurement system, there is no absolute requirement that the low bidder be selected. It's usually phrased the lowest qualified bidder. And in those cases, you could get into some dispute over the awarding official's interpretation as to who was the lowest responsible bidder.
Lowest qualified. If we have the lowest qualified bidder in the process, are there instances there where states don't award the contracts to the lowest qualified bidder?
In our view, or we wouldn't have raised the issue if we had found absolute assurance that in cases where the lowest bidder was not selected, that there were absolutely clear and prevailing reasons why that wouldn't happen. In our view, though, bidders who were qualified were passed over in favor of others. Reasons given, but it's again a question of dispute as to whether the reasons are legitimate or not.
Do you find states agreeing to modifications of contracts, change orders, without producing adequate justification?
Yes, Senator, that's another situation. Again, we're back to what should be standard, good government kinds of practices. When those are lacking, when they're not available for whatever reason, they either don't exist in the state system or they're simply abused, you get into problems. And that is, again, another clear example of what we found.
So then, if those weaknesses are abundant, then we would have to ask EPA to establish a process by where they're more demanding from the states for reimbursement if they're going to.
That's exactly correct. We did, as I said in my testimony, principally three audits of EPA regions from that point of view, that we think they need to be more aggressive and more demanding in making sure that, again, the basic kinds of good government procurement practices are followed. And if they do that, sure, there are going to be problems, but I think they're going to be diminished a great deal.